I don't need a housekeeper anymore. I need a wife before sunset. The suitcase slipped from Charlotte Bennett's fingers and struck the dirt. 38 cents shifted in her pocket. 1,000 miles behind her. Nothing ahead. And a stranger in a dust-worn hat had just asked her to marry him in the next 4 hours. She thought he was mocking her. He wasn't. If you love stories about second chances and the quiet courage it takes to start over, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And comment the city where you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. The stagecoach had already turned around by the time Charlotte understood the man wasn't joking. She heard the wheels groaning behind her, heard the driver click his tongue at the horses, heard the whole rattling contraption pull away in a slow cloud of grit, and she wanted more than she had wanted anything in months to run after it, to throw herself back into that cramped, sweat-soaked box and beg the man to take her anywhere else. Back east. Back to the ruins of her old life. Back to a place where at least she understood the shape of her own misery. Instead, she stood frozen in the yard of a stranger's ranch, staring at the tall figure on the porch steps, and she said the only thing her mind could form. "I'm sorry. I don't think I heard you correctly." "You heard me fine," the man said. He didn't move towards her. That was the first thing she noticed. A lesser man would have crossed the distance, tried to loom over her, tried to press the advantage of his size and her desperation. This one stayed where he was, one boot up on the step, his hat low, his hands loose at his sides, like a man who had already made peace with whatever answer she gave. "The advertisement said housekeeper," Charlotte said. Her voice came out thinner than she meant it to. "Food and lodging. I traveled 11 days to answer it. 11 days, Mr. Cole, Nathan Cole. Mr. Cole, I answered a job. Not whatever this is. I know what the advertisement said." He came down one step, and the afternoon light shifted across his face, and she saw he was younger than his voice suggested, and more tired than any young man had a right to look. "I wrote it. 3 weeks ago I needed a housekeeper. 3 weeks ago I still had a chance of keeping this place the honest way. And now I need a wife by sundown, or I lose everything my mother and father spent 30 years building." He said it flat, no drama in it, like reading a feed bill. "So no, ma'am, I'm not mocking you. I don't have the time to mock anybody." Charlotte's hands had gone cold. She was aware of that distantly the way you're aware of weather. Her palms had gone cold, and her mouth had gone dry, and there were 38 cents in her pocket, and no coach coming back until Thursday, and she had not eaten since a heel of bread in Cheyenne the morning before. "That's insane," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You don't know me. You don't know a single thing about me. I know you came 1,000 miles for a job that pays in room and board." Nathan Cole looked at the suitcase in the dirt, and then at the dust on her hem, and then briefly at her face. "I know a woman doesn't do that unless she's got no other door left to walk through. That's about all I need to know. And it's more than most men would tell you before they asked." She hated that he was right. She hated it so much her eyes stung, because that was exactly it. That was exactly the arithmetic of her ruin laid bare in one sentence by a man she'd met 90 seconds ago. No other door. Not one. Behind her was a father, broken by men who'd framed him for their own crimes. A family name spat on in every parlor from Boston to Philadelphia. A fiancé who had returned her ring by courier the very week the newspapers printed the Bennett scandal in letters 2 inches tall. There was no door behind her. There had never been a door behind her. There had only ever been this. A stagecoach. A newspaper clipping folded soft as cloth from being read 100 times. And 38 cents. "I need to sit down," she said. He was beside her before she finished the sentence, not touching her just there, one hand hovering near her elbow like he expected her to fall and didn't want to be the reason she did. "Porch," he said. "There's shade and water." The water was cold and clean, and she drank 2 full ladles of it before she trusted herself to speak again, and Nathan Cole let her. That was the second thing she noticed. He didn't fill the silence. He didn't explain himself, didn't justify, didn't pile words on top of words the way desperate men do. He leaned against the porch rail 8 feet away and let her put herself back together, and only when the color had returned to her face did he speak. "You want to know why," he said. "I want to know everything," Charlotte said. "I want to know why a grown man is asking a stranger to marry him at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I want the truth, Mr. Cole, because I've had a belly full of lies this year, and I can taste them now the way you'd taste sour milk." Something moved across his face. It might have been respect. It was gone too fast to name. "There's a man named Victor Langford," Nathan said. "Owns most everything west of the river. Cattle. The bank note on half the town. 2 county commissioners in his pocket and working on a third. 6 months ago he decided he wanted this valley. My valley. Land my father broke his back clearing before I was born. So sell it to him. He doesn't want to buy it. Buying's for honest men." Nathan's jaw tightened. He wants to take it. And he found a way. There's an old territorial statute, a homestead provision, says a single man holding this kind of parcel has to prove continuous productive occupancy, and if a competing claim gets filed, a married household takes precedence over a bachelor holding. It's a rotten little law nobody's used in 20 years. Langford's lawyer dug it up special. Charlotte set the ladle down slowly. "And you're not married." "I'm not married. Never had cause to be. And Langford filed a competing claim through a straw buyer, some cousin of his wife's, a married man with a household. County commissioner rides out tomorrow morning to rule on it." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something break through the flat calm, something raw underneath it. "If I'm a bachelor when that man arrives, I lose. Everything. The house, the herd, the graves out back where my folks are buried. Langford takes it all legal as Sunday, and there's not a court in the territory will give it back." The silence stretched. A hawk called somewhere. A loose board ticked in the heat. "How long have you known?" Charlotte asked. "About the claim 9 days. About the law." He almost laughed. There was no humor in it. 6 days. I've spent 6 days riding to every farm in this valley trying to find a woman who'd stand up in a church with me. Widow Hargrove turned me down flat. The Peterson girl's father ran me off with a shotgun. I asked a saloon woman in town, I'm ashamed to say it, but I did, and even she had better sense than to tie herself to a dead man's land. He shook his head. And then a stagecoach pulls into my yard, carrying a woman who answered an advertisement I forgot I ever placed. 6 days of no, and here you are. Ew. Here I am, Charlotte repeated faintly. I'm not going to pretend it's not desperate, Nathan said. It's the most desperate thing I've ever done. But I won't lie to you, and I won't force you, and if you say no, I'll drive you back to town myself and pay your fare east, and you'll never see me again. That's my word, for whatever a dead man's word is worth to you. And there it was, the thing that undid her. Not the tragedy of it. She'd had a year of tragedy. She'd developed calluses. It was the decency underneath the desperation. A drowning man going down for the last time, and still he was telling her the water was cold. Still he was offering to pay her fare away from him. She had known men who lied when they had everything to gain. This one told the truth when he had everything to lose. I want conditions, Charlotte heard herself say. Nathan went very still. Ma'am, you heard me fine, she said, and something almost like a smile pulled at the corner of her mouth, bitter and exhausted and alive. If I'm going to do the most foolish thing anyone in my family has ever done, and God knows we've set a high bar this year, then I want conditions, in writing, before I set one foot in that church. Name them. She named them at the kitchen table, and Nathan Cole wrote them down in a cramped, careful hand, and later Charlotte would think of that hour as the strangest business negotiation of her life. 2 strangers, a stub of pencil. The sun sliding lower in the window. Bargaining over the terms of a marriage neither of them wanted. Fair wages, she said. The same you'd have paid a housekeeper. A marriage doesn't turn a woman into free labor. Agreed. Write it $12 a month. 15. His pencil stopped. This ranch is 9 days from losing everything, and you're haggling me for $3. This ranch is 9 days from losing everything, Charlotte said evenly, which means you need me more than I need you. 15. He looked at her a long moment. Then he wrote 15, and beneath his hat brim, she thought she saw the first genuine flicker of something in his eyes that wasn't exhaustion. Equal authority over the household accounts, she went on. I don't work where I can't see the books. I've watched what happens when a household hides its ledgers from itself. My father's whole life came apart from bad books he trusted other men to keep. I won't sign into blindness. Agreed. And I leave whenever I choose. Not 2 years, not any fixed term. The day I decide to go, you drive me to the coach and you don't argue. That's my door, Mr. Cole. I'll not marry into a locked room. I've been in one. I know the shape of the walls. That one landed differently. She saw it land. He set the pencil down and looked at her with an attention he hadn't given her yet. Not the appraising look a man gives a woman, but the sober look one wounded creature gives another when it recognizes the wound. Whenever you choose, he said quietly. You have my word on that above all the rest. I'd sooner lose the ranch than keep a woman here against her will. I mean that. Write it however you need it written. And Charlotte, who had learned that year to trust nothing, and no one, felt something unclench in her chest that she had not expected to feel again. Not gratitude exactly, but the strange relief of being believed, of being taken seriously, of sitting across a table from a man who did not want anything from her that she wasn't freely choosing to give. She signed her name, Charlotte Ann Bennett, in a hand that only shook a little, and Nathan Cole signed beneath it and folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket over his heart and said, The preacher closes his book at sundown. We've got maybe an hour. Can you be ready? I've been ready to leave one life or another for 11 days, Charlotte said. An hour is a luxury. The town was smaller than the word deserved. A rutted street, a church, a general store, a smithy, a saloon, and not much else, pretending otherwise. Nathan drove the wagon hard and said almost nothing the whole way, and Charlotte held the seat rail with both hands and watched the light go gold, and then amber, and understood with a rising vertigo that she was about to marry a man whose middle name she did not know. The preacher met them at the church door, with his watch already in his hand. Nathan Cole, the old man said, and his eyes went from Nathan to Charlotte and back with a slow dawning astonishment. You found one. I found one, Reverend. Son, I have known you since you were knee-high, and I married your mother and father, and I buried them, and I baptized you. The preacher lowered his voice, though there was no one to hear. Are you going to tell me this is real? Nathan didn't flinch. It's legal, Reverend. I won't lie to you in your own doorway. It's a bargain, and she knows it's a bargain, and she signed it of her free will, and I mean to honor every word of it. But it's legal, and it's honest, and if you close that book on us, it's the same as handing Victor Langford the deed yourself. The old man looked at Charlotte then, really looked at her. Young woman, he said, you understand what he's asking of you. I understand it better than he does, I expect, Charlotte said. I've read the terms twice. He's read them once. And the preacher, who had married the desperate and the foolish and the deeply in love across 40 years, and had learned that they did not always come clearly labeled, looked at this strange, dusty, iron-spined woman, and looked at the boy he'd baptized and let out a long breath. Then step inside, he said. The Lord's business doesn't wait for sundown, but the county does, and I'll not let Langford win on a technicality. Fetch me 2 witnesses off the street. Quickly now. The blacksmith stood on Nathan's side, still in his leather apron smelling of coal and iron. The general store owner stood on Charlotte's, having locked up his shop and come over out of nothing but the town's insatiable hunger for something to talk about. There was no dress. There were no flowers. There was no music, but the wind coming through the cracked shutters, and the preacher's steady old voice reading the words that men and women had been saying to each other since long before Wyoming had a name. And Charlotte Bennett, who had once imagined her wedding in a Philadelphia cathedral with 300 guests and a gown from Paris, and a man who had smiled at her across ballrooms and returned her ring by courier the moment her name turned to poison. Charlotte Bennett stood in a plank church in the last gold light of a Wyoming evening and married a cattleman she'd known for 2 hours. Do you, Charlotte Ann Bennett, take this man? I do, she said before he'd finished, and was surprised to find she meant the 2 words she said, even if she meant nothing beyond them. "Do you Nathan James Cole?" "James," she thought. "His name is James." "I do," Nathan said. "Then by the authority granted me by God and the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you man and wife." The preacher closed his book. The last edge of the sun touched the horizon in the window behind him. "You beat the sun down by about a minute and a half, son. The Lord and the calendar are both satisfied. You may—" He paused, because there was of course the matter of the kiss, and both of them had gone rigid at the same instant, and the blacksmith was studying the ceiling with great interest, and the store owner was studying his boots. "You may," the preacher said gently. "Shake hands if that's the covenant you've made. Nobody in this room will think the less of you." And Nathan Cole turned to his wife of 4 seconds and put out his hand, grave as a banker, and Charlotte looked at that hand, calloused, scarred across 2 knuckles, steady. And she thought of every man who had ever wanted to take from her, and she put her hand in his and shook it once firm. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Mrs. Cole," he answered, and neither of them smiled. But something passed between them anyway, in the callous and the grip and the steadiness, some small unspoken agreement more binding than the paper in his breast pocket. It was done. They rode back in the dark, and the cold came down off the mountains, the way it does in high country, even in summer. And Charlotte sat beside her husband on the wagon seat, with her one suitcase between them, like a wall. "You should know," Nathan said after a long while. "The house only has the one bedroom that's fit for anything. My folks' old room. I've been sleeping in the bunkhouse with the hands around the kitchen bench since—" He stopped. "For a while. The room's yours. I'll not come near it, and I'll not come near you. That's part of the bargain, even if we didn't write it down." "We should write it down," Charlotte said. "Then we'll write it down. And I'll cook," she said, "and keep the house and keep the books. That was the job I came for. I'll do the job whether or not there's a ring involved. I don't take wages for nothing." "You'll do more than the job," Nathan said. "You'll be the reason this place is still standing tomorrow afternoon. Don't sell that short." She didn't answer. She was looking up at the mountains, huge and black against a sky thick with more stars than she had ever seen in her life. More stars than she'd known existed, and she felt the enormous strangeness of where she'd landed pressed down on her. A married woman on a failing ranch in a territory 1,000 miles from every person who'd ever known her name. "You're safe," she told herself. "For tonight at least you're safe, and you're fed, and you have a roof, and that's more than you had this morning." But safety had betrayed her before. She'd learned not to trust the feeling. The house by the small light of a lantern told her more about Nathan Cole than an hour of conversation had. It was clean in the way a lonely man's house is clean swept, but bare. A woman's touches, long gone. A faded sampler on the wall, stitched by hands that no longer lived a rocking chair. No one rocked in a shelf of preserving jars, gone empty and dusty. Everywhere she looked, she saw the ghost of a home that had once been full and was now only surviving. A man alone keeping the walls standing over the memory of a family too stubborn to let it fall and too haunted to make it live. Charlotte set her suitcase down in the doorway of the bedroom, her room now, and turned back. Nathan was standing in the kitchen hat in his hands at last, and without it, he looked stripped, somehow younger and more exposed. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a stranger he's just realized is going to be living in his mother's house. "There's coffee if you want it," he said. "And I don't have much. Beans, some salt pork, bread that's a day past good. When did you last eat a real meal, Mr. Cole?" He thought about it. That was the answer that he had to think about it. "I've been busy," he said. Charlotte took off her traveling coat and hung it on a peg by the door, as though she had hung it there 1,000 times, and rolled up her sleeves. "Sit down," she said. "I'll not have my husband of 1 hour fainting into the fire on his own ranch. It'd be a poor beginning." And something in Nathan Cole's face came apart very quietly when she said the word husband, not because of what it meant between them, which was nothing, but because a woman was standing in his mother's kitchen, rolling up her sleeves, and the house had not held that sound. The small domestic clatter of a person choosing to feed another person in more years than he wanted to count. He sat down. He watched her find the beans, find the skillet, find the salt, like she'd lived there her whole life, and he said low, "Why'd you say yes?" Charlotte didn't turn from the stove. "Because you told me the truth," she said. "Every man I've trusted in the last year lied to me while he ruined me. You told me the truth while it ruined you. I decided a truth that costs the teller something is worth more than a lie that costs him nothing." She set the skillet on the heat. "It's not a reason a sensible woman would give. But I stopped being sensible around the time I bought a stagecoach ticket with the last of my inheritance. So, there's your answer." Nathan was quiet a long time. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "you're the least foolish person I've talked to in 6 days." "That's a low bar, Mr. Cole. You told me one of them was a saloon woman with more sense than you." And for the first time, the very first time, Nathan Cole laughed. A short, startled, rusty sound, like a hinge that hadn't been made to move in a long while. And Charlotte at the stove, with her back to him, allowed herself the smallest of smiles that he would never see. She would remember that first night for the rest of her life, though nothing happened in it. She fed him. He ate like a man who'd forgotten food was a thing you did on purpose. She washed the single skillet and the 2 plates while he sat at the table and told her in the halting way of a man not used to talking about the ranch, how many head of cattle he had left, which fences were down, which hand he trusted, and which he thought was already looking for other work. She listened. She asked sharp questions. She began without either of them naming it to do the very thing she'd been hired for. And when the lantern burned low, she went into the dead woman's bedroom, and she sat on the edge of the bed in her traveling dress, because she could not bring herself to undress in a stranger's house. And she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and did not cry, because she had promised herself in Cheyenne that she was finished crying, and she nearly kept the promise. Down the hall she heard the kitchen bench creak as her husband lay down on it, rather than come near her closed door, exactly as he'd said he would. He kept his word, she thought. The first thing he told me, and he kept it. It was such a small thing. It should not have mattered so much. It mattered more than anything had mattered in a year. The county commissioner arrived at 10 the next morning, and he did not come alone. Charlotte heard the horses first. More than one rider, more than 2, and she came out onto the porch with a dishcloth still in her hands, and her hair pinned up, and Nathan's mother's apron tied around her waist, and she watched 3 men ride into the yard, and she knew before anyone spoke a word which of them was Victor Langford. He was the one who did not look tired. Everyone in that valley looked tired. The commissioner a harried official with ink-stained fingers, the deputy beside him sweating in his collar. But the third man sat his horse like a man who had never once in his life lost anything he'd decided to keep, and he looked at Charlotte on the porch with a slow, cold assessment that made her want to go inside and lock the door. She did not go inside. She'd done enough running. "Morning," Nathan said, coming around the side of the house with his hands loose and easy, though Charlotte could see the tension humming under it. "Commissioner Watts, you're prompt." "Nathan." The commissioner touched his hat, uncomfortable official. "I'll come straight to it. There's a competing claim on this parcel under the occupancy statute. I'm obligated to rule on it today. Mr. Langford's here on behalf of the filing party. On behalf of my wife's cousin," Langford said pleasantly. His voice was smooth as poured cream. "A married man, a productive household, which, as I understand, the statute takes precedence over forgive me, Nathan, a bachelor holding. Sad situation. But the law's the law. Even I have to bow to it." And here it was, the knife's edge. Everything Nathan Cole had, everything his parents had bled for, balanced on a technicality and a smile. "There's just one difficulty with your claim, Mr. Langford," Nathan said. "Is there?" "I'm not a bachelor." The smile on Victor Langford's face did not move, but something behind his eyes did a flicker quick and cold, like the shadow of a hawk crossing the ground. "Commissioner," Nathan said, and he reached into his breast pocket, and Charlotte saw with a jolt that it was not the contract he drew out, but a different paper, the marriage certificate, the ink barely a day dry. I was married yesterday evening in the church in town. Reverend Hollis performed the ceremony. 2 witnesses signed. It's dated and it's stamped, and it's a full day ahead of any ruling you're set to make. This is a married household. The competing claims got no standing. Commissioner Watts took the certificate. Read it. Read it again. And the relief on his honest, harried face was almost painful to watch, the relief of a man who had ridden out expecting to do something he found shameful and had just been handed a reason not to. This appears to be in order, Watts said. Fully in order. Married the 11th, rulings the 12th. The household predates the ruling by a clear day. He looked up and there was iron in his voice, now that hadn't been there before. The competing claim is denied, Mr. Langford. This parcel stays with the Coles. The silence in the yard was total, and Victor Langford turned his horse slowly and looked at Charlotte Bennet on the porch, at the apron, at the pinned-up hair, at the dishcloth in her hands, and he smiled. And it was the worst thing she had ever seen, that smile, because it was patient. "Congratulations," he said softly to her, to only her, "on your marriage. It was very sudden, wasn't it? I do hope it lasts. Marriages entered into in haste so often turn out to be built on nothing at all, and a thing built on nothing." He let the pause hang. "Well, it doesn't take much to knock it down." "You've lost Mr. Langford," Charlotte said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that later, that her voice did not shake. The commissioner ruled, "You should go home. I've lost today, Mrs. Cole." He touched his hat to her, courtly and venomous. "But I've been at this a great deal longer than you've been married, and I have found over the years that most things a person builds in a single afternoon can be taken apart just as quick." He gathered his reins. "Do give my regards to your new husband. Such a lucky man, to find a wife so conveniently. I wonder what a woman runs from to marry a stranger in an afternoon. I expect I'll find out." He rode out, and Charlotte Bennet stood on the porch and watched the dust of him settle, and she understood that whatever she had married into yesterday, it had just become a war. Nathan came up the porch steps slowly. The commissioner and the deputy were already turning their horses, the official business done, eager to be gone from a place that had nearly forced them into a wrong. He stopped 1 step below her, so their eyes were nearly level, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "He knows," Charlotte said at last. "Knows what? That it's not real. He looked at me and he knew." She was still watching the empty road. "He's going to come after the marriage. Not the land, he can't touch the land now. He'll come after us. He'll try to prove it's a sham so he can void the household and reopen the claim." She turned to Nathan, and her face was very pale and very calm. The calm of a woman who has already survived one man deciding to destroy her. "I've seen this before, Mr. Cole. I've watched a powerful man decide to take a person apart. This is how it starts. With patience. With a smile." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "You know him," he said slowly. "Not him, but you know this." "I know this," Charlotte said. "I know it the way you know a wound before the weather's even turned. The men who ruined my father smiled exactly like that." She wrapped the dishcloth tighter around her hands. "I came out here to get away from men like Victor Langford, and I married straight into another one's path." "You didn't marry into his path." Nathan's voice was low and rough and certain. "You saved this ranch. You beat him. He rode off that road with nothing, and he rode off because of you. Whatever he does now, you didn't walk into it. You stood in front of it. There's a difference, and I'll not have you forget it while you're standing on my porch." And Charlotte, who had been braced for pity, or for panic, or for a man crumbling now that the immediate danger had passed, found instead a man planting his feet. It was not what she'd expected. Almost nothing about Nathan Cole was what she'd expected. "He said he'd find out what I ran from," she said quietly. "Then he'll find out." Nathan didn't blink. "And it won't matter, because whatever it is, whatever they said about you back east, I signed a paper yesterday, and I signed it with a woman I'd known 2 hours, and I'd sign it again today, knowing what I know now. You beat Victor Langford before you'd had breakfast in my house. I don't much care what a Philadelphia newspaper thinks of a woman who can do that. Charlotte stared at him. I never told you I was from Philadelphia. Nathan went still. And into that stillness came the sound they'd both been half listening for, without knowing it. Hoofbeats again, a single rider this time, coming fast up the road from town. Not Langford, not the commissioner. Someone new riding hard, kicking up a long banner of dust, and as the rider drew close enough to see, Charlotte felt the ground tilt very slightly under her feet. Because she knew the way that man sat a horse. She had watched that man ride away from her once in another life on the worst morning of her year. She knew him. And Nathan Cole, watching his wife's face drain of every last drop of color, said in a voice gone suddenly hard, "Charlotte? Who is that?" She could not answer. The rider pulled up at the edge of the yard and swung down and pushed his hat back, and Charlotte Bennett heard her own name spoken in a voice she'd prayed never to hear again. A voice that had returned her ring by courier. A voice that belonged to a man who had no business, no possible honest business, being 1,000 miles from Philadelphia in the yard of a Wyoming ranch on the very morning her new life had begun. "Charlotte," the man said, breathless, urgent, as though no time at all had passed, as though he had any right to say it. Thank God I found you in time. You have to listen to me. You have no idea what you've married into. You have no idea who that man really is." And Nathan Cole stepped up onto the porch and put himself quietly and completely between his wife and the stranger in the yard. "Get off my land." Nathan Cole didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He said the 4 words the way a man says them when he means to be obeyed, and the stranger in the yard stopped 3 paces from the porch steps like he'd walked into a fence he couldn't see. "You don't understand," the man said. He was breathing hard from the ride, his fine eastern clothes gray with trail dust, and up close Charlotte could see what a year had done to him. The softness gone from around his eyes, replaced by something hungrier. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to save her. Charlotte." He tried to look past Nathan, tried to find her face. "Charlotte, tell him who I am." But Charlotte couldn't speak. She stood frozen with the dishcloth twisted white in her hands, and the whole ruined year rose up in her throat and choked her, because the last time she had heard that voice, it had come folded inside a note, in that same careful handwriting, saying, "Under the circumstances, I'm sure you'll understand. His name is Edward Ashby," she said finally. Her voice came out flat and strange, like it belonged to someone else. "He was my fiancé, until my father's name went into the papers. Then he was nothing at all." Nathan didn't take his eyes off Edward. "That's not the whole of it," Edward said quickly. "There were pressures, my family. You can't imagine the position I was in. So it's true." Nathan's voice was very quiet now. "You returned this woman's ring when she needed you, and you rode 1,000 miles to find her the same morning she got herself safe. That's a curious kind of loyalty, mister. Shows up right after the danger's past. I came because I heard what she was walking into." Edward's jaw tightened. "I have friends in the Territorial Land Office, Cole. I know exactly what you are. I know this ranch is drowning in debt. I know a man named Langford's been circling it like a buzzard. And I know a man that desperate will marry any woman fool enough to step off a coach and use her up and throw her out the day the papers clear." He looked at Charlotte, and his voice softened into something that had once made her believe him. "You married a drowning man, Charlotte. He didn't marry you. He grabbed you. There's a difference, and you're too proud to see it." And the terrible thing, the thing that made Charlotte's stomach turn over, was that he wasn't entirely wrong. That was exactly what she'd done. That was exactly the shape of the bargain. She'd married a drowning man to save herself from drowning, and any honest accounting of yesterday would have to admit it. And Edward Ashby had always known how to find the one true thing in a room and use it like a blade. "You're right," Charlotte said. Both men turned to her. "He was drowning. I stepped off a coach with 38 cents and nowhere left to go, and he needed a wife by sundown, and we made a bargain, and it saved us both." She lifted her chin. "Every word of that is true, Edward. And I'll tell you what else is true. In the 2 hours I knew him before I married him, that drowning man told me more truth than you told me in 3 years of courting." So if you rode 1,000 miles to inform me I married a desperate man, you're too late. I knew it before the preacher opened his book. I married him anyway. And I'd do it again standing here in front of you. Edward's face went white, then red. You don't mean that. I have never, Charlotte said, meant anything more. For a moment, nobody moved. A horse stamped. The wind pulled at the loose porch board. And then Edward Ashby did the thing that told Charlotte everything about who he had become. He stopped pleading, and his voice dropped low and ugly, and the mask came all the way off. Fine, he said. Play the loyal wife. But understand something, both of you. I didn't ride out here on sentiment. Langford's people found me in Cheyenne 2 days ago. They know who I am. They know what I was to her. He looked at Charlotte, and there was no love left in his face at all, only a cornered man's calculation. They offered me a great deal of money to swear an affidavit. That your marriage is a fraud. That you're a woman of ruined character who'd sign any paper for a roof. That I can testify to your arrangement. He swallowed. I told them I wanted to see you first. I told myself I'd give you a chance to come away clean before you sold me, Charlotte said softly, to the same kind of man who sold my father. Edward flinched like she'd struck him. Get off my land, Nathan said again. Last time I'll ask. You'll want to hear my price first, Edward said. And there it was, the real thing, the thing he'd come for. Because Langford's money is on the table whether I take it or not. But I'm a reasonable man. I'd rather be paid to stay quiet than paid to speak. So the question isn't whether I testify Cole. The question is, which of you pays me not to? 10. The silence that followed was the coldest thing Charlotte had ever felt. Because this was it laid bare in a dusty yard, the exact machine that had destroyed her family. A powerful man with money. A weak man with a price and a truth twisted just far enough to look like a lie in front of a court. She'd watched it grind her father to dust. She knew every gear of it. And now it had followed her 1,000 miles and set up shop in the yard of the one place she'd let herself feel safe. She waited for Nathan to answer, braced for it. Because a desperate man, a man drowning in debt, a man who'd just barely saved his land. That man might beg, might bargain, might try to scrape together money he didn't have to buy. Edward's silence. Instead, Nathan Cole laughed. It wasn't the rusty, startled laugh from the kitchen the night before. It was low and hard, and it made Edward Ashby take a step backward. Let me be sure I've got this, Nathan said. You rode 1,000 miles to shake down a man you were told is broke. You crossed half a continent to sell false witness against a woman you claim you came to save. And now you're standing in my yard on land that has 3 generations of my family buried in it, asking me which coward gets to pay you. He came down one step, then another. Mister, I wouldn't give you the price of your coach fare home. Not to save this ranch. Not to save my own neck. You want to know why? Edward said nothing. Because a man who can be paid to lie can always be paid a little more to lie differently. Nathan was on the ground now level with him, and though Edward was the taller man, he suddenly looked smaller. You go take Langford's money. Go on. Swear whatever affidavit he's bought. But you swear it knowing I'll be there in that same courtroom, and I'll stand up and I'll tell the judge exactly what happened in this yard this morning, how you offered to sell your testimony to the highest bidder before you decided what the truth even was. And then let's see whose word a jury believes. The rancher or the jilting Eastern dandy who peddles his oath like eggs at market. Charlotte watched Edward's face and saw the calculation flicker behind his eyes, saw him realize too late that he'd shown his whole hand to a man who wasn't going to fold. You'd never make it stick, Edward said, but the confidence had gone out of it. Maybe not, but I'd make it loud. Nathan's voice never rose. And a man in your line of work, a man who sells his word, can't afford loud. One town hearing about how Edward Ashby put his oath up for auction, and you're finished at every land office and bank on the eastern seaboard. So here's my offer since you came so far for one. He leaned in. You climb back on that horse. You ride back to Cheyenne. And you tell Victor Langford, that the well he sent you to poison is dry. That's the whole of it. That's the only deal you're getting off this porch." For a long, taut moment, Charlotte thought Edward might do something stupid. His hand twitched toward his coat, and Nathan saw it and went absolutely still, in the way of a man who has been in real fights and is not afraid of one more. Then Edward Ashby, who had never in his life been brave when it cost him anything, let his hand fall. "You'll regret this," he said. It came out thin. "I've got a whole list of regrets, mister." Nathan stepped back and gestured at the road with an open hand, almost courteous. "You won't crack the top 100. Edward turned to Charlotte one last time. And whatever he'd meant to say, some final wound, some last twist of the knife he'd carried 1,000 miles, it died in his throat because Charlotte Bennett was looking at him with an expression he had never once seen on her face in 3 years of courtship. She was looking at him like he was small. "Goodbye, Edward," she said. "You should have kept the ring. It was the most honest thing you ever gave me, and you couldn't even keep that." He mounted. He rode. And Charlotte stood on the porch and watched the second man in one morning ride off her new life's road in a cloud of his own dust, and she waited to feel triumphant, and instead she felt only hollow and very tired, and afraid in a way she couldn't yet name. She made it inside before her legs gave out. Nathan caught her elbow at the door. The first time he'd touched her, really touched her, and even then it was only to steady her, his grip careful as a man handling something he'd been told might break. He walked her to the kitchen bench and set her down and got her water, and she drank it, and slowly the room stopped tilting. "He was going to sell me," she said. Her voice was very small. "He looked me in the eye and put a price on me, same as they did to my father." She pressed the cold cup against her forehead. "I keep running, Mr. Cole. I ran from Philadelphia. I ran 1,000 miles. And it just gets on the next coach and follows me." "It didn't follow you." Nathan crouched down so he was below her, looking up so she didn't have to lift her head. "Langford went and found it. Fetched it out of Cheyenne Special. That's not you carrying trouble, Charlotte. That's a rich man spending money to hurt you. There's a difference, and I need you to hold on to it, because he's counting on you not being able to tell the two apart. He wants you to believe you're the poison. You're not. You're the thing he can't buy, and that's a whole different creature." Charlotte lowered the cup and looked at him. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked. "It's not in the bargain. Kindness wasn't in the paper. You could keep the land and treat me like a hired hand, and I'd have no complaint coming. Why kind?" Nathan was quiet a moment. He seemed to be deciding something. "My mother came out here the same way you did," he said finally. "Not the same trouble, but the same shape of it. Answered an advertisement my father placed back when this valley was nothing but grass and rattlesnakes. Married a man she'd met twice. Folks in town talked about her for years, the mail-order wife they called her, like it was something to be ashamed of." His jaw worked. "She was the finest person I ever knew. Built this whole place beside my father board by board. And she died, still hearing that word behind her back in church. Mail order, like she was a sack of flowers somebody sent for." He looked at the empty rocking chair across the room. "So when a man rides into my yard and tries to put a price on my wife and calls her a woman of ruined character who'd sign any paper for a roof mister, he's not just insulting you. He's insulting the woman who raised me. And I'll be kind to you every single day of your life before I let another Ashby or another Langford make you feel the way this valley made my mother feel." Charlotte stared at him, and something happened in her chest that she had promised herself in Cheyenne would never happen again. A small, dangerous door came unlatched just a crack. "That's the longest speech you've made since I met you," she said unsteadily. "It'll be a while before I make another." He stood up and put his hat back on and became in the space of a breath the closed-off cattleman again. "There's work. Langford's going to hit us somewhere, and I'd rather be ready than sorry. You said equal authority over the books. You meant it." "I meant it." "Then get them out. All of it. Every ledger, every bill, every note I owe." He was already moving toward the door. "If we're going to fight a man who buys courtrooms, we'd best know, down to the penny, what we've got to fight him with. And I've been too proud to look at those numbers straight for about 2 years now. Time somebody did. What Charlotte found in those ledgers over the next 3 days nearly stopped her heart. Not because the ranch was failing, she'd known that from the empty preserving jars and the day-old bread. It was failing in the way of an honest operation that had run out of hands and hours, and that kind of failing she could fix. She'd fixed worse. She sat at the kitchen table from before dawn until the lantern guttered, and she pulled Nathan Cole's whole ruinous, disorganized, stubbornly kept financial life apart, column by column, and she began slowly to see the shape of a thing that could be saved. But that wasn't what stopped her heart. What stopped her heart was the note. She found it folded into the back of the oldest ledger, a promissory note dated 11 years back in Nathan's father's hand, and it was made out to the First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne for a sum that had seemed small at the time and had, through the quiet violence of compound interest, grown into a debt that hung over the ranch like an axe. And at the bottom, where the note listed who now held it, because notes get bought and sold because a bank in trouble sells its paper to whoever will buy it, she found a name. The note was no longer held by the bank. It had been purchased 18 months ago by the Langford Land and Cattle Company. Victor Langford owned the debt on the Cole Ranch. He'd owned it for a year and a half. Charlotte sat very still for a long time. And then she understood, with a cold clarity that made her hands go steady, the whole terrible architecture of what was happening. Because a man who merely wanted your land might file a claim and lose. But a man who held your debt didn't need to win a single ruling. He only needed to call the note. He could demand the full sum all at once, any day he chose. And no honest ranch in this territory could pay a debt that size on demand. Nathan couldn't. Nobody could. The occupancy claim had never been the real weapon. It had been the feint. Something to make Nathan spend himself defending the front door, while Langford quietly held the key to the back. "Nathan," she called, and her voice must have carried something, because he came in from the yard fast wiping his hands. "What is it?" She turned the ledger around and put her finger on the name. He read it. She watched him read it. She watched the color drain out of his face the way it must have drained out of hers, and she watched him understand it exactly as fast as she had, because he was not a stupid man. He had only been a proud one. "He owns the note," Nathan said. It wasn't a question. "He's owned it 18 months. Charlotte kept her voice level because one of them had to. "He can call it any time he wants. Today, tomorrow, the morning after you thought you'd won. And when he calls it and you can't pay, he takes the ranch, legal as Sunday." Nathan sat down heavily in the chair across from her and put his hands flat on the table and stared at nothing. The claim was never going to work. He knew it wouldn't work. He filed it just to keep me looking one way. "While the real gun was already at your back," Charlotte finished. "Yes, then it doesn't matter." His voice had gone hollow. "None of it. The marriage, the ruling, none of it. He can end this whenever he pleases. We didn't beat him yesterday. We made him smile and wait." He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw the bottom of his despair, the place beneath all that stubborn calm. "I dragged you into a fight that was already lost, Charlotte. I let you marry a dead man after all. He was right. Ashby was right." And Charlotte Bennett, who had spent a year watching men be right about her ruin, felt something turn over inside her. Not despair, but its exact opposite. A hard, bright anger she hadn't felt since the day the newspapers printed her father's name. "No," she said. "Charlotte, no?" She stood up and put both hands flat on the ledger and leaned across the table at him, and her eyes were burning. "You listen to me, Nathan Cole, because I know something about this you don't. I sat in a room while lawyers took my father apart with exactly this kind of paper. Debt and notes and clever men who buy your ruin ahead of time. I watched it happen, and I was too young and too frightened to fight it, and my father died believing there was nothing anyone could have done." She was shaking now, but not with fear. "There's always something. A note bought in bad faith to strangle an honest man off his land. That's not just business. That's a scheme, and schemes have seams. And I have spent one entire year of my life learning where the seams are. So don't you dare sit at my table and tell me it's already lost. Don't you dare." Nathan looked up at her. And whatever he saw in her face, the fury, the certainty, the year of grief, turned suddenly into a weapon. It put something back into his that had gone out of it a minute before. "You think there's a seam?" he said slowly. "I think a man who buys a note in secret and sits on it 18 months is a man who doesn't want anyone asking how he came to own it." Charlotte's mind was moving fast now, faster than it had moved in a year, all the old sharp machinery she'd shut down out of grief roaring back to life. The First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne. Why did they sell your father's paper? Banks don't sell good notes on productive land. They sell paper when they're desperate or when someone leans on them. And the same man who bought your debt owns 2 county commissioners already. She looked at him. "Nathan, was that bank in trouble 18 months ago? I don't know. Maybe." There was talk. He was leaning forward now, caught up in it despite himself. There was talk that summer of the Cheyenne Bank nearly folding. Bad loans, they said. It got bought out, reorganized, new men on the board. "New men," Charlotte repeated softly. "I'd bet you this ranch that if we pull the record of who bought into that bank when it was drowning, who put up the money to save it, who got a seat on the board for their trouble, we'll find the same name that's on the bottom of your note. He didn't just buy your debt, Nathan. I think he engineered the trouble that let him buy it. And if he did..." Her eyes came up to his, bright and hard. "If he did, then that note isn't a debt at all. It's evidence of exactly what he did to a bank full of honest ranchers to get his hands on their land." The kitchen was silent, and then slowly, Nathan Cole began to smile. Not the hard laugh he'd given Edward Ashby, and not the rusty, startled thing from the first night, but something new, something that had hope in the middle of it. "You'd have made a hell of a lawyer," he said. "I'd have made a hell of a lot of things," Charlotte said, "if the world let women be them. But it doesn't, so I'll settle for making Victor Langford wish he'd never bought a note in Cheyenne." She was already pulling a clean sheet of paper toward her, already dipping the pen. "We need the bank's records. We need to know who else in this valley he's done this to, because a man doesn't build a scheme this big for one ranch. There are others. There have to be. And a dozen ruined ranchers all telling the same story is a thing even a bought commissioner can't smile his way past." Nathan watched her write, watched the plan take shape in her cramped fast hand, and he shook his head slowly. "This morning, your old fiancé rode in to sell you," he said. "And by supper, you've turned the whole thing around and gone on the attack. How does a person do that?" Charlotte didn't look up from the paper. "You do it," she said quietly, "because the alternative is letting him win, and I have already let a man like him win once, and I buried my father because of it. I don't have another one of those in me, Nathan. I truly don't. So we don't lose." She signed the bottom of the page, a list of names, a list of records, the first battle plan she'd drawn in her life. We just don't lose. That's the whole strategy. Everything else is details. They started with old Amos Pruitt because he was the nearest neighbor, and because Nathan said if anyone in the valley had been ground down by Langford and lived to be bitter about it, it was Amos. He was a widower in his 70s, hard of hearing and harder of temper, and he met them at his gate with a shotgun broke open over his arm, and he took one look at Charlotte in the wagon and said to Nathan, "Heard you finally married. Heard it was sudden. Heard a lot of things." He spat. "Well, she the mail-order kind like your ma," Charlotte answered before Nathan could. "I'm the kind who lost everything to a man with lawyers and lived to hunt him down," she said. "And I hear you might be that kind too, Mr. Pruitt, so I'd put the gun up. We're the only friends you've got coming up this road today." The old man stared at her a long moment. Then he snapped the shotgun closed, and something that might once have been a smile cracked his weathered face. "Well," he said, "sudden marriage, sharp tongue. Reckon there's steel in you after all." He turned toward his sagging cabin. "You'd best come in. And you'd best have a reason for stirring up things I've spent 3 years trying to forget." Inside over coffee, bitter enough to strip paint, Amos Pruitt told them a story that made Charlotte's blood run cold, because it was in every particular that mattered the same story as her father's. He'd owned twice the land he owned now. He'd had a note with the Cheyenne Bank, small, manageable, the kind every rancher carried. And then the bank had gone wobbly and been bought out. And 8 months later, a stranger had ridden up his road with paper in his hand. Langford's man, and called the whole note due at once, and Amos couldn't pay, and so Amos had signed over the eastern half of his land for pennies, rather than lose all of it in court. "I signed," the old man said, and his voice cracked on it the shame of 3 years. "Couldn't fight paper, didn't have the money and didn't have the years, so I signed, and he took the best of my land, and he smiled at me while I did it. Same as he smiled at Chalmers before me, same as he smiled at the widow Dean and the Osgoods and the Reyes family down on the flats." He looked up, his old eyes wet. "There's a dozen of us, Mrs. Cole. A dozen honest families ground down and signed away one at a time, so quiet nobody ever put it together. Because he never took two in the same season. Never gave us cause to gather and talk. Just one, and then another patient, as a man picking apples." Charlotte set down her coffee. Her hand was perfectly steady. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "would you sign a statement saying exactly what you just told me dates? The name of the man who called your note. The price he forced on you." The old man went pale. "Sign my name against Victor Langford. He'd finish me. Take the rest of my land out of spite. I'm 74 years old, girl. I got nothing left to fight with." "You've got the truth," Charlotte said. "And you're not signing alone. You're signing with a dozen families who all tell the same story, and my husband and me. He can crush one old man. He can't crush a dozen families and a signed record and a scheme laid out plain enough for an honest judge to see. He's been winning because you were all alone in the dark, each of you thinking you were the only one. The minute you stop being alone, Mr. Pruitt, the minute you all light your candles at once, he's got nowhere left to hide." Amos Pruitt looked at her for a long, long time. Then he looked at Nathan. "Where'd you find her?" "Off a stagecoach," Nathan said, "with 38 cents. 38 cents. The old man wheezed out a laugh. "Hell, Langford spent a fortune buying up this valley and got beat by a woman with 38 cents. He pushed himself up out of his chair joints cracking and went to a drawer and came back with a stub of pencil and a face that had for the first time in 3 years something other than defeat on it. "Write it out, girl. Write out what I said. I'll put my name to it. And I'll tell you where the widow Dean lives and the Osgoods and every last family that old thief bled white." His hand shook, but his voice didn't. "Been waiting 3 years for somebody to be angry enough. Didn't figure it'd be a bride with 38 cents. But I'll take it. God help me, I'll take it."
Chaw.
They came home after dark, the wagon bed rattling with something it hadn't carried out that morning, a signed statement, the first of them, and a list in Charlotte's hand of 11 more families to visit. And Nathan drove in silence for a long while, and then he said without looking at her, "You want to know the strangest part of this whole strange week? Tell me. 9 days ago, I was a man alone waiting to lose everything, and I couldn't see any way through it but to marry a stranger and hope." He clicked to the horses. "And tonight I'm still a man about to lose everything, and I've got a signed statement in the wagon and a list of a dozen fighters and a plan, and I feel—" He shook his head. "I don't have the word for what I feel. I haven't felt it in so long, I forgot it had a name. Hope," Charlotte said softly. "The word is hope, Nathan. I'd forgotten it too." He was quiet a moment. "I didn't marry a housekeeper," he said. "Did I?" "No," Charlotte said. "You married a woman who's going to burn Victor Langford's whole rotten kingdom down to the dirt. I just hadn't remembered I was her yet when I stepped off that coach. She was buried pretty deep under a year of grief." She looked up at the stars, the impossible spill of them. "You dug her back up, Nathan Cole. I don't know if you meant to, but you did." They rode the rest of the way in a silence that had for the first time no wall in it. But Victor Langford did not build a kingdom by being slow, and he had eyes in that valley that had been serving him for years, and he learned within 2 days that the new Mrs. Cole had ridden out to see Amos Pruitt, and then the Widow Dean, and then the Osgood place, and that everywhere she went, the ground she left behind was no longer quiet. So on the fourth day, when Charlotte and Nathan rode back into their own yard at dusk, with 2 more signed statements in the wagon, they found the front door of the house standing open. Nathan was off the wagon before it fully stopped moving fast and low, and Charlotte came behind him with her heart in her throat, and they went through the door together into a house that had been searched, not robbed. Searched. Every drawer pulled. The ledgers thrown across the floor. The mattress in the bedroom slashed open, its stuffing spilled like snow. Someone had come while they were gone and torn the house apart, looking for exactly one thing, and Charlotte knew what it was before Nathan said it, because she'd have looked for the same thing in Langford's place. "The note," Nathan said, kneeling in the wreck of the ledgers. "The original promissory note. The one with his company's name at the bottom showing he holds it." He looked up, and his face was grim. "It's gone, Charlotte. He sent someone to take it back. Without that paper, we can't prove he owns the debt, and without proving that, we can't tie him to the bank scheme at all. It was the whole thread, the one that unravels the rest." He sat back on his heels amid the ruin. "It's gone." But Charlotte Bennett was not looking at the wreckage. She was smiling. She was standing in the middle of her torn-apart home, and she was smiling the way a card player smiles when the man across the table finally overplays his hand. "Nathan," she said, "the morning I found that note, do you remember what I did before I called you in from the yard?" He frowned. I don't know. You were sitting at the table, reading." "I read it," Charlotte said. "And then I did what my father never taught me to do until it was too late to save him. The one lesson I swore I'd never forget." She crossed to the wrecked kitchen, to the shelf of empty preserving jars his mother had left, and she reached to the very back behind the dusty glass and drew out a folded square of paper and held it up between 2 fingers. "I copied it," she said. "Every word. In my own hand, dated and witnessed by Amos Pruitt that same afternoon. And then I hid the original somewhere no thief of Langford's would ever think to look, and left the real prize sitting in plain sight in the ledger, so that when he sent his man to steal it back, he'd take the bait and think he'd cut the thread and stop worrying about us." She lowered the paper, and her eyes were bright and cold and triumphant. "He didn't steal our evidence tonight, Nathan. He just proved he was afraid of it. A man doesn't send someone to burgle a house for a note he came by honestly. He tipped his whole hand, and he doesn't even know it." Nathan Cole stood up slowly in the middle of his ruined kitchen and looked at his wife of 4 days. "Where's the original?" he said. "The real one." Charlotte's smile widened. "Somewhere Victor Langford would have to dig up his own guilty conscience to find," she said. "Which means it's safe forever. Now help me put this house back together, husband, because tomorrow we ride to Cheyenne. And we are going to find out exactly who saved that bank from drowning 18 months ago, and I already know whose name we're going to find at the bottom of the water." Cheyenne was 2 days' hard ride, and they made it in a day and a half, and the whole way Charlotte turned the plan over in her mind like a woman worrying a stone. The bank had been reorganized 18 months ago. New men on the board. Someone had put up the money to save it from folding, and that someone had gotten a seat at the table for their trouble, and Charlotte would have wagered her life she knew the name. But wagering wasn't proof. Proof lived in the incorporation records at the territorial clerk's office, a matter of public record that no one had ever bothered to read, because no one had ever thought to connect a drowning bank in Cheyenne to a dozen ruined ranches spread across a valley 100 miles away. No one but her. "There's a thing you should understand about men like Langford," she told Nathan as they rode into the outskirts of the city. "They're careful about the crime and careless about the paperwork. They cover the killing, but they sign the deed. Because the deed is the whole point. The land, the money, the power, they can't enjoy it if it's not in their name. So it's always in their name. Somewhere. You just have to be willing to read 100 boring pages to find the one line that hangs them." "And you've read 100 boring pages before," Nathan said. "I read 1,000, Charlotte said quietly. "Trying to save my father. I found the line that would have hanged the men who framed him. I found it 3 weeks after he died." She looked straight ahead. So don't tell me it can't be done, Nathan. I know it can be done. I just did it too late once. I'm not going to do it too late twice. Und. The territorial clerk was a small, dusty, unhurried man who clearly hadn't been asked to fetch anything in a hurry in years, and he brought them the incorporation records of the reorganized First Territorial Bank with the air of a man doing a great favor to people who wouldn't understand it. Charlotte understood it. She sat at the long table in the back of the clerk's office and read for 4 hours without lifting her head, and Nathan sat across from her and watched her read and did not say a word, because he had learned in a week and a half that when Charlotte Bennett went hunting through paper, silence was the only useful thing a man could offer. And on the 3rd hour, she stopped. Her finger came down on a line of cramped official print, and she went very still, and Nathan leaned forward and said, "What?" "The bank was recapitalized in the spring of '82, Charlotte said slowly. $15,000 put up by a single investor in exchange for controlling interest and a seat on the board. The investor is listed as the Meridian Holding Company." She looked up. "Not Langford. Meridian." Nathan's face fell. "Then it's a dead end. It's some other—" "It's not a dead end." Charlotte was already turning pages fast now, her eyes bright. "Because a holding company is just a name a man hides behind. And every holding company has to file its own incorporation listing its principles. It's the law. It's tedious and nobody reads it, and that's exactly why they do it. Meridian is the mask. Somewhere in this office there's a paper that says, 'Who's wearing it?'" She stood up and called across the room. "Sir, I need the incorporation filing for the Meridian Holding Company. Every principal. Every officer." The clerk sighed the sigh of a man whose quiet afternoon had died. But he went, and he dug, and 20 minutes later he came back with a thin folder, and Charlotte opened it and read the single page inside, and Nathan watched all the breath go out of her at once. Charlotte. She turned the page around. She put her finger at the bottom on the line that listed the principal officer of the Meridian Holding Company, the man who owned the mask, that owned the bank that had strangled a dozen honest families off their land. The name on the line was not Victor Langford. The name on the line was Marcus Langford. "His brother," Nathan breathed. "He put it in his brother's name." "No," Charlotte said, and her voice had gone strange. "Nathan, Victor Langford doesn't have a brother. Everybody in that valley knows it. He's the last of his line. It's the whole reason he's so hungry for land. He's got no heir, nothing to leave. He told half the county so." She stared at the name. Marcus Langford isn't his brother. Marcus Langford is a name Victor invented. A paperman, a ghost he built to hold his crimes at arm's length. Which means... Her eyes came up and they were burning. Which means, if we can prove Marcus Langford doesn't exist, that he's a fiction Victor created, then every deed, every note, every dollar that ran through Meridian was Victor's done in a false name to hide a scheme. That's not hard business, Nathan. That's fraud. That's forgery. That's a prison term, not a lawsuit. Nathan sat back slowly. "How do you prove a man doesn't exist?" "You don't," Charlotte said. "You prove that every place he's supposed to exist, he doesn't. No birth record, no land in his own name, no bank account he ever touched himself, a signature that always matches Victor's hand a little too well." She was already gathering the papers, her mind racing 3 moves ahead. "It's slow. It's 100 small proofs of absence stacked into one mountain of guilt. But it's there, Nathan. He built a ghost, and a ghost leaves a very particular kind of trail, the trail of a thing that was never really alive." And then the clerk, who had been standing behind them the whole time listening, cleared his throat. They both turned. The small, dusty man had gone pale, and his hands were trembling on the edge of the table, and he looked at the door of his own office like a man afraid of who might come through it. "You want to be careful," he said very low, saying that name in this town. "You know something," Charlotte said. It wasn't a question. The clerk swallowed. "I've filed papers in this office for 22 years, ma'am. I file everything. I don't read most of it, and I remember less. But I remember the Meridian filings because the man who brought them in—" He stopped, started again. "He brought them himself, Victor Langford. Stood right where your husband's standing. And he signed the officer's line, the Marcus Langford line, right in front of me with his own hand. And then he looked at me, and he put a $20 gold piece on my desk, and he said, "You've got a poor memory, haven't you, friend?" The clerk's voice shook. I took the gold piece. God forgive me, I took it. But I never forgot. You don't forget a thing like that. You keep your head down and you pray nobody ever comes asking. The room was dead silent. Would you swear to that? Charlotte said softly. That you watched Victor Langford sign the name Marcus Langford with his own hand. Would you put it in writing and sign it and stand up in a courtroom and say it? The clerk looked at her for a long time. And Charlotte saw the war in his face, the 22 years of keeping his head down, warring against the 22 years of shame, and she did not push him, because she had learned that the ones you pushed broke, and the ones who came to it themselves held forever. My daughter, the clerk said finally. She married an Osgood, out on the flats. His voice cracked. They lost half their place to that man 2 years back. My own grandchildren, ma'am. Turned out of half their land by a scheme I helped file with my own hands and took gold to forget. He wiped his eyes with the back of a shaking hand. I've been carrying that a long time. Longer than you've been alive some days it feels like. He straightened and something firmed in his soft, dusty face. Yes, I'll swear it. I'll swear it, and I'll sign it, and I'll say it to God and the judge both. You bring me the paper, and you find me somewhere Langford's reach doesn't stretch, and I'll tell the whole of it. It's past time. Lord, it's past time. Charlotte reached across the table and took the old clerk's trembling hand in both of hers. Then we've got him, she said. We've got him, Mr. Fenwick, the clerk said. Harold Fenwick. And you've got the beginning of him, ma'am. But you listen to me now because I know this town and you don't. He gripped her hands hard, urgent. Victor Langford has men in every office in this city. Somebody saw you come in here today. Somebody's already writing to tell him a stranger woman spent 4 hours in the territorial records reading about Meridian. By the time you get back to that valley, he'll know. He'll know exactly what you found, or close enough. And a man who put a gold piece on my desk and threatened my memory 20 years ago. His voice dropped. That man does not fight fair when he's cornered. You've stopped being a nuisance to him, Mrs. Cole. As of today, you're a mortal threat, and he'll treat you like one. Ta-ta-ta. They rode out of Cheyenne at first light with copies of everything, and Charlotte's mind should have been racing with strategy, but instead it kept circling back to one thing Fenwick had said, and about noon on the ride home, she finally spoke it aloud. He's going to come for us before we can bring it to court, she said. Isn't he? Fenwick's right. Langford won't wait for a courtroom he might lose. He'll try to stop us reaching one at all. Nathan didn't answer right away. There's a hearing on the occupancy claim in 11 days, he said finally. He filed it, remember. Even though it's dead, it's still on the books. Commissioner Watts has to formally close it. Everybody who's anybody in the valley will be there. It's the biggest thing to happen in that county in a year. He looked over at her. If we're going to put this in front of the law, in front of witnesses with the whole valley watching, so he can't just make it disappear, that hearing's our chance. It's the one room he can't lock us out of and can't lie his way through quiet. We get everyone there. Pruitt the widow, Dean Fenwick, all the ruined families, all the signed statements, the note, the incorporation papers. We don't sue him. We expose him. In front of every soul in that valley at once. 11 days. Charlotte said. 11 days. He'll spend every one of them trying to stop us reaching it. She stared down the road ahead. So the real question isn't whether we can prove it, Nathan. We can prove it. The question is whether we live 11 more days to stand up in that room and say so. They did not have to wait long to find out how far Victor Langford would go. On the 7th day before the hearing, Charlotte woke before dawn to the smell of smoke. She was up and shaking Nathan awake before her mind had even named the fear, and he was out the door bootless with a rifle in his hands, and by the time Charlotte reached the yard, the whole north pasture was a wall of fire, the dry summer grass going up like tinder, driving straight toward the barn, where the last of the herd was penned, and toward the house behind it. What followed was the worst night of Charlotte's life and the making of her marriage, because there was no time to be strangers. There was no time for the wall of the bargain or the careful 8-foot distance Nathan Cole had kept between them for a week and a half. There was only the fire and the two of them, and a fight they could not win alone, and so they stopped being alone. Nathan threw open the barn and drove the terrified cattle out toward the river, and Charlotte hauled water from the well until her hands bled and her lungs filled with smoke. And when the fire jumped the wagon track and came for the house itself, they fought it side by side with wet blankets and buckets and the ragged, wordless coordination of two people who had suddenly, in a single burning hour, become one thing instead of two, and they were losing. The fire was too big and they were too few, and Charlotte felt the moment the fight tipped toward hopeless felt. Nathan feel it too. Saw him look at the house, his mother's house, his father's house, the graves out back, and saw him make the terrible calculation of a man deciding what to save and what to let burn. And then hoofbeats, many of them, coming out of the dark. Charlotte turned half-blind with smoke, certain it was Langford's men come to finish what the fire started, and instead she saw Amos Pruitt at the head of a dozen riders. The whole Broken Valley, the widow Dean and the Osgoods, and every family that had signed her statements, come pouring onto the Cole Ranch with shovels and blankets and barrels of water because word of the fire had run across the flats faster than the flames. "Heard you had a fire!" Old Amos bellowed, already off his horse and swinging a wet sack. "Figured it was the same snake that burned the rest of us out one by one. Well, he don't get to do it one by one. No more does he, girl, not no more." They saved the house. By the time the sun came up, the north pasture was a black ruin and the barn was half gone, and every soul in that yard was scorched and staggering. But the house stood, and the herd was safe across the river, and no one had died, and a dozen families who had spent 3 years each believing they were alone in the dark stood together in the smoking dawn and understood finally that they never had been. Charlotte found Nathan at the edge of the burned pasture as the light came up. Both of them black with soot, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "It was him," Nathan said at last. His voice was a ruin of smoke. "It was set. I found where it started. Coal oil poured along the north fence line. This wasn't lightning. He tried to burn us out before the hearing." "I know." "He tried to burn us alive in our beds, Charlotte." "I know." She was looking not at the burned pasture, but at the yard behind them, at the dozen families moving through the smoke, sharing water, tending each other's burns, a whole valley of the ruined and the robbed, standing on the Cole Ranch in the dawn. "But look what he did, Nathan. He was so afraid of us reaching that hearing that he lit a fire, and the fire brought the whole valley here. Every family he ever wronged all in one place, all seeing at once that it was the same man, the same snake, the same fire. He didn't scatter us. He gathered us." She turned to him, and her soot-black face was fierce. "He's not fighting a rancher and his wife anymore. He just lit a signal fire that called his whole army of enemies into one yard, and they're not afraid of him anymore. Look at them. They're not afraid." Nathan looked, and what he saw was a valley that had in the space of one burning night stopped being victims and started being a jury. But Charlotte had learned that a man like Victor Langford was most dangerous exactly when he was losing, and she was right to fear it because the fire was not his last move. It was his second to last. 4 days before the hearing, a rider came up the mended road to the Cole Ranch, not a hired burglar this time, not a hired torch, but a lawyer in a black coat, a smooth young man with a leather case and a smile that Charlotte recognized instantly as a trained echo of his employer's. "Mrs. Cole," the lawyer said, not dismounting, holding out a folded document. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Victor Langford. He asked me to deliver this personally and to wait for your answer." Nathan took the paper before Charlotte could. He read it, and Charlotte watched his jaw go tight and his face go pale, and she took it out of his hands and read it herself, and the ground seemed to drop away beneath her. It was not a threat. That was the terrible cleverness of it. It was an offer. Victor Langford offered in exchange for the return of all documents pertaining to Meridian and the withdrawal of any claims against him to forgive the entire debt on the coal ranch. Free and clear. The note torn up. The land theirs forever unencumbered. And more, he offered to purchase the ranch outright at 4 times its value. Enough money to make Nathan Cole and his wife wealthy for the rest of their lives. Enough to buy a fine house anywhere they chose. Enough to make the whole scorched nightmare of the past 2 weeks simply disappear. All they had to do was walk away, take the money, burn the Meridian papers, and let the valley go on believing whatever it wanted to believe. "He's buying us off," Nathan said very quietly. "The land free and clear and a fortune on top. Charlotte, that's more money than my father saw in his whole life. That's the ranch saved and set for good, and never having to fight another day." He stared at the paper. We could take it. We could take it and never worry about him again. Charlotte looked at her husband, and she understood in that moment that this was the real test, not the fire, not the burglary, not Edward Ashby. This, a man who had grown up watching his family bleed for this land, was being offered everything he'd ever fought for wrapped in a bow in exchange for one small silence. And she saw the pull of it on his face, the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting his whole life and was being offered at last permission to stop. "It's a good offer," Charlotte said carefully. "It's the best offer you'll ever get, Nathan. And I'll not decide it for you. It's your land, your family, your father's grave. If you take it, I'll stand beside you and never say a word against it, and we'll be rich and we'll be safe." She paused. "But I want you to understand exactly what he's buying. Because he's not buying our silence about the note. He can make the note disappear himself. He's buying our silence about the others. Pruitt, the widow Dean, the Osgoods, Fenwick's own grandchildren. Every family that signed a statement believing we'd carry it into that courtroom." Her voice was very steady. "If we take his money, we get everything. And they get nothing. He keeps their land forever, and they go on being robbed, and the only difference is that we got paid to look away." She met his eyes. "That's what 4 times the value costs Nathan. It costs them. That's the price. He just wrote it in a way where you don't have to see their faces when you pay it." The lawyer waited, smiling his borrowed smile. Nathan Cole stood in the yard of his family's ranch holding a fortune in one hand, and Charlotte watched him look out across the burned north pasture toward the road toward the flats where a dozen ruined families were waiting to hear whether the Coles would carry their fight or sell it. And then Nathan Cole handed the paper back to the lawyer without a word, and the lawyer's smile faltered. "Mr. Cole," the lawyer said, "I don't think you understand the magnitude of what's being—" "I understand it fine." Nathan's voice was quiet, and it was final. "You tell Victor Langford I said no. Not because I don't want the money. Lord knows I do. I've been broke my whole life, and he knows it. Tell him I said no because my mother came to this valley a stranger, same as my wife, and this whole county spent 30 years making her feel small over it. And she took it, and she never once fought back, because she didn't have anybody standing beside her." His jaw was set like stone. "Well, I've got somebody standing beside me now, and she's got a dozen families standing beside her, and I'm not going to be the man who takes a fortune to leave them in the dark my mother died in. You tell him that. Word for word. Tell him the Coles don't sell." The lawyer's smile was entirely gone now. "He told me you'd say something like that," the lawyer said, folding the paper away slowly. "He told me to give you a second message if you refuse the first." He gathered his reins. "He said to tell you that everything up to now has been business. Offers, papers, the ordinary give and take of men who want the same land." He looked down at them, and for the first time the borrowed smile showed its teeth. "He said to tell you that after today it stops being business. And he said you should ask your wife what happened to the last honest man who thought he could beat Victor Langford in a courtroom." The lawyer turned his horse. "He said she'd know. He said to ask her about her father." And he rode away. The silence in the yard after the lawyer's dust settled was the loudest silence of Charlotte Bennett's life, because Nathan Cole was staring at her now and she could see the question forming the terrible pieces sliding together in his mind, and she wanted to run from it, the way she'd wanted to run from everything for a year, and there was nowhere left to run. "Charlotte," Nathan said slowly, "how does Victor Langford know about your father?" "I don't." "You never told me the whole of it?" His voice wasn't angry. It was worse than angry. It was gentle and searching and afraid. "You told me your father's business collapsed. Framed by powerful investors, you said. Ruined, and then he died. But you never told me who. And that lawyer just told me to ask you about your father like it's a thing Langford's known all along." He took a step toward her. "How does a cattle baron in Wyoming know how your father died in Philadelphia?" And Charlotte Bennett, who had run 1,000 miles from this exact question, felt the last wall she'd been hiding behind for a year finally crack all the way through. "Because it wasn't Philadelphia," she whispered. "Not really. My father's business was banking Nathan. Investment. He backed men who were building things out west, railroads, cattle operations, land companies. He put good Philadelphia money into Western ventures, and he was careful, and he was honest, and he was good at it." Her voice was shaking now, the year of grief pouring out of the wound at last. "And one of the ventures he refused to back because he looked at the books and saw it was a fraud, saw it was a scheme to swindle honest ranchers off their land. One of the ventures my honest father wouldn't touch and threatened to expose." She couldn't finish. She didn't have to. "Meridian," Nathan said. The word fell out of him like a stone. "Your father found Meridian." "He found it," Charlotte breathed, 3 years ago. "He found the scheme before it was even finished, and he wrote letters, and he threatened to bring it to the authorities, and then—" Her face crumpled. "And then the papers back east printed that my father was the fraud, that he was the swindler. All the crimes he'd found laid at his own door so perfectly that no one believed him when he swore otherwise. His partners abandoned him. Edward left me. The name went into the mud. And my father—" Her voice broke entirely. "My father died believing he'd failed. Believing there was nothing anyone could do against men that powerful. Believing the truth he'd found had died with his ruined name." She looked up at Nathan, tears cutting clean lines through the soot still on her face. "I didn't come west by accident, Nathan," she said. "That's the part I never told you. I didn't just answer a housekeeper's advertisement in a valley I picked off a map." Her whole body was shaking. "I came here because in my father's papers in the last box of his ruined life, there was one name he'd underlined 3 times. One man he was certain was behind Meridian. One man he swore in the last letter he ever wrote would answer for it someday if there was any justice left in the world." She could barely say it. "The name was Langford. I came to this valley hunting Victor Langford, and I stepped off a stagecoach and I met a cowboy who needed a wife by sundown, and I had no earthly idea. Nathan, I swear before God, I had no idea that I'd just married the one man in the whole territory that Victor Langford was already trying to destroy." The yard was utterly silent. Nathan Cole stared at his wife of 2 weeks, and Charlotte watched every certainty he had about her rearrange itself, and she waited for the anger, waited for the betrayal, waited for him to understand that she had married him under a secret and to hate her for it. "So, it was never chance," Nathan said slowly. "The advertisement was chance," Charlotte whispered. "The valley wasn't. I came here for him, Nathan. Not for you. Not for a job. I came here to find the man who killed my father and make him answer for it, and I told myself I'd find some quiet way, some housekeeper's job, that'd let me stay in the valley and dig, and instead, the very first day, the very first hour, I married straight into the center of the whole thing." She was crying openly now, past shame, past hiding. "And I fell into your fight, and it turned out to be my fight all along, the same fight, the same man. And I didn't tell you because at first I didn't trust you, and then—" Her voice failed. "And then I did trust you. And by then, I was too afraid of losing the one good thing that had happened to me in a year to risk telling you the truth. That's the shameful whole of it. I kept a secret from a man who never kept one from me. I'm sorry. God, Nathan, I'm so sorry." Nathan Cole was quiet for a long, long time, And then he did the last thing Charlotte expected. He closed the distance between them, the 8 feet, the careful distance he'd kept for 2 weeks. And he took her soot-streaked face in both his scarred hands gently, the way he'd once offered her only a handshake, and he made her look at him. "Charlotte," he said, "listen to me. Are you listening?" She nodded, unable to speak. "You didn't fall into my fight," Nathan said low and fierce, "and I didn't fall into yours. Don't you see it? We were fighting the same man from 2 different sides of the country for 3 years, and neither of us knew the other one was there. Your father found the scheme in Philadelphia, and Langford destroyed him for it. My family held the land the scheme wanted, and Langford spent 2 years trying to take it. Same snake, same fight, the whole time." His thumbs wiped the soot and the tears from under her eyes. "You didn't marry a stranger and drag him into your war. You married the one man on this earth who was already in it. And I didn't marry a housekeeper to save my land. I married the one woman alive who had the papers to bury the man trying to take it." His voice cracked just slightly. "That's not a secret, Charlotte. That's not a betrayal. That's the 2 of us finally not being alone in the dark. Your father died thinking there was nobody. He was wrong. There was you, and now there's me. And there's a whole valley." Charlotte's knees nearly gave. He held her up. "I hid it from you," she wept. "For 2 weeks You hid a grief so big you could barely carry it," Nathan said. "For 2 weeks from a man you'd known for 2 weeks. That's not a sin, Charlotte. That's a wound. And I'll not fault you for a wound the same men gave me." He pressed his forehead to hers, soot to soot, and Charlotte felt the last wall between them come down entirely, felt the bargain, finally fully become something else. "Your father wrote that Langford would answer someday if there was justice left in the world." His voice was iron now, and low, and absolutely certain. "There's 4 days to that hearing, and I'm going to stand up in front of the whole valley, and I'm going to help you prove every word your father died trying to say. He was right, Charlotte. He was right all along, and we're going to make the whole world know it." And Charlotte Bennett, who had carried her father's ruined name 1,000 miles and had never once let herself believe it could be redeemed, broke down completely in the arms of the stranger she'd married by accident and by fate, and let herself for the first time in a year be held. They didn't hear the rider until he was almost in the yard. They broke apart, and Charlotte wiped her face, and Nathan's hand went toward the rifle by the door. And then they both went still, because it was not one of Langford's men, and it was not the lawyer come back. It was Commissioner Watts, the honest, harried official who had ruled in their favor 2 weeks before. And he was riding like the devil was behind him, and his face, when he pulled up in the yard, was the gray of a man who had seen something that had shaken him to his bones. "Cole," Watts said before he was even off his horse. "Mrs. Cole, thank God you're both still. I rode straight here. I didn't stop, He swung down breathless. "It's the hearing. The occupancy hearing 4 days out. Langford's had it moved up. He's pulled every string he owns in the territorial government, and he's had it moved up." "Moved up to when?" Nathan said. Commissioner Watts looked at them, and Charlotte saw in his face that whatever hope they'd been building toward for 2 weeks had just been yanked out from under them. "Tomorrow," Watts said. "The hearing's tomorrow morning, and that's not the worst of it." He swallowed. "He's not just closing the occupancy claim anymore. He's added a new filing to be heard the same session. A petition to have your marriage declared fraudulent and void with a sworn affidavit already on file to support it." The commissioner's voice dropped. "Signed and witnessed by a man named Edward Ashby." They had one night to do what Charlotte had planned to do over 4 careful days, to gather a dozen scattered families to bring Harold Fenwick 100 miles from Cheyenne, to organize a mountain of evidence into an argument even a bought commissioner couldn't wave away. One night because Victor Langford had bought the calendar itself and moved the ground out from under them. Charlotte stood in the yard with the commissioner's dust still hanging in the air, and Nathan watched her, and he saw the exact moment she stopped grieving and started fighting. "Then we don't sleep," she said. "Charlotte, we don't sleep and we don't panic, and we use the one thing he didn't count on." She turned to Watts sharp and fast. "Commissioner, You rode here to warn us. That means you're not his. That means somewhere under all that string pulling, there's still an honest man holding the gavel. Am I right? Watts hesitated. Then slowly he nodded. He owns the 2 commissioners west of the river. He does not own me. He thinks moving the date up gives him a room full of his own people, and no time for you to bring yours. The official's jaw tightened. He forgot that I set the order of business in my own hearing. I can't stop his filings, but I can decide what gets heard first and how long each side gets to speak and whether I allow testimony from the floor. He looked at them grimly. It isn't much, but it's the one thing he couldn't buy because he didn't think he needed to. If you can get your people to that hearing by morning, I'll give you room to be heard. That's my word. It's the same word I gave 2 weeks ago, and I've been ashamed every day since of how close I came to breaking it. Then here's what we do, Charlotte said, and the plan came out of her whole and fast. A year of buried strategy finally set loose. Nathan, you ride to Pruitt tonight. He knows every family in this valley, and they'll come for him when they won't come for us. Every family that signed, every family that was robbed, I want them in that hearing room by dawn, statements in hand. Watts, you ride back and hold that gavel honest, and you find a way to seat Fenwick if he makes it. And She stopped. And you what? Nathan said. And I deal with Edward, Charlotte said quietly. Because his affidavit is the one thing that can void this marriage. And if the marriage voids, the whole household defense collapses, and Langford reopens the land claim, and every other thing we've built falls with it. The evidence against Meridian doesn't matter if we're not a lawful household with standing to bring it. Her eyes were hard. Edward's the crack in the whole wall, and I'm the only one who knows how to close it because I'm the only one who knows exactly what kind of coward he is. He's 100 miles gone by now, Nathan said. Or in Langford's pocket in Cheyenne. No. Charlotte shook her head slowly. He's not gone. A man like Edward doesn't sign a false affidavit and ride away clean. He signs it, and then he sits somewhere close, sweating, waiting to see if it works, terrified of what he's done, and even more terrified of not getting paid for it. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead. He's in town, at the hotel or the saloon, close enough to collect from Langford the moment the marriage voids. That's where cowards wait. Nathan as close to the money as they dare, and no closer to the danger than they have to be. She reached out and gripped his arm. Go to Pruitt. Bring me an army by morning. Let me handle the coward. I've been handling his kind my whole life. It's the one thing I'm truly good at.
Captain Egg.
She found Edward Ashby exactly where she said he'd be, in the corner of the town's only hotel dining room, a bottle in front of him, a man drinking to quiet a conscience that wouldn't stay quiet. He looked up when she walked in, and the naked fear on his face told her everything. He hadn't expected her to come. He'd expected to hide behind paper the way he always had. Charlotte. He half rose. How did you... Sit down, Edward. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat calm as Sunday and folded her hands on the table. You look terrible. You look like a man who signed something he can't take back and can't live with. I know that look. My father wore it the last year of his life right up until it killed him. Only my father earned his by being honest. You earned yours the easy way. I didn't have a choice. You always have a choice. Charlotte's voice was very quiet and very level. That's the thing about you, Edward. You've spent your whole life pretending you don't because a man with no choices can't be blamed for anything. But you chose to send back my ring. You chose to ride out here to sell me. And you chose to sign a false oath for Victor Langford's money. Everyone a choice. So don't sit there and tell me you had none. I'm not the girl who believed you anymore. That girl died about the same time my father did. Edward's hand shook on the bottle. What do you want? I want you to understand what you signed, Charlotte said. Because I don't think you do. I don't think Langford told you the whole of it. She leaned forward. You swore my marriage is a fraud. Fine. But Langford's not using that oath to win a land claim, Edward. He tacked it onto a hearing where I am about to stand up and prove that he swindled a dozen families off their land, forged a false identity to hide behind. Burned my husband's ranch 4 nights ago and destroyed my father. Your prospective father-in-law. The man whose daughter you were going to marry with the exact same scheme. She watched his face. So when your affidavit gets read into that record tomorrow, you won't be a jilted suitor settling a score. You'll be the man who took Victor Langford's money to help him finish covering up the murder of the Bennett family name. That's what you signed, Edward. You just signed your name onto the same crime that ruined the woman you once claimed to love. Did he tell you that apart? Did he mention whose father you'd be helping bury a second time? Edward had gone white. He didn't tell me, he whispered. He didn't tell me about your father. He just said you'd married for a roof, that it was a sham, that I'd only be swearing to what was true. And you believed a man like that, Charlotte said, because it was easier than asking questions. Same as always. She sat back. Here's what's going to happen tomorrow. Edward and I want you to hear all of it before you decide. Either that affidavit gets read, and you go into the territorial record forever as Victor Langford's paid witness, and when Langford falls, and he is going to fall, every man who helped him falls with him, and you'll answer for perjury and a false oath, and there won't be a land office or a bank on the eastern seaboard that'll touch you. Or, she let it hang. Or you walk into that hearing tomorrow of your own free will, and you stand up before Langford's own lawyer reads a word, and you withdraw the affidavit. You tell the truth. That Langford paid you to swear falsely. That you did it and you're ashamed and you're taking it back. He'd destroy me. He's going to destroy you either way, Charlotte said gently. That's what you never understood about men like him, Edward. You think if you serve them well enough, they'll protect you. They don't. You're a tool to him. And tools get thrown away the second they've been used, especially tools that can testify to what they were used for. The only question is whether you go down as his accomplice, or as the man who found his spine one day too late and told the truth. She stood up. I'm not asking you to be brave. I know you're not brave. I'm asking you to be smart. For once in your life, choose the side that isn't going to burn. She looked down at him, and there was no cruelty in it, only a terrible, weary pity. My father would have given you a second chance. He gave everyone one. It's part of what got him killed. So I'll give you his one chance, Edward, on his account, not yours. 9 o'clock tomorrow. The hearing. Choose well. And she walked out and left him alone with the bottle and the choice, and she did not know, riding home in the dark, whether she'd reached him or only frightened him deeper into Langford's arms. She wouldn't know until morning. The hearing room was the town's church, the only building big enough, and by 9 o'clock it was fuller than it had ever been for any sermon, because Nathan Cole and Amos Pruitt had ridden the whole valley in the dark, and the valley had come. They filled the pews and lined the walls and stood 3 deep at the back. The widow Dean, the Osgoods, the Reyes family up from the flats. Every family that had been ground down, one quiet farm at a time, sitting shoulder to shoulder in the light for the first time, no longer alone, no longer scattered, no longer afraid. Charlotte walked in on Nathan's arm and felt the whole room turn to look, and she understood that Victor Langford had made his one fatal error. He had moved the hearing up to deny her time, and instead he had summoned into a single room every enemy he'd made in 15 years. Langford himself sat at the front, unhurried, unworried, flanked by his black-coated lawyer, and he looked at Charlotte as she came in, and he smiled the patient smile, and it did not touch her the way it had 2 weeks ago. She had learned by now what it was worth. Commissioner Watts took his seat, and he set his gavel down, and he looked out over the packed room with the face of a man who had decided finally which kind of official he was going to be. This session is called to order, Watts said. We have 2 matters, the closing of an occupancy claim on the Cole parcel and a petition to void the Cole marriage. Mr. Langford's counsel has filed both. He paused. I'll hear the petition to void first, as it bears on standing for all that follows. Counsel, you may present your affidavit. The black-coated lawyer rose smoothly and lifted a paper. Thank you, Commissioner. We have a sworn statement from a Mr. Edward Ashby, formerly of Philadelphia, attesting that the marriage between Nathan Cole and the woman known as Charlotte Bennett is a fraudulent arrangement entered into solely to defeat a lawful land claim, and that as such. I'd like to withdraw that affidavit. The voice came from the back of the room, and the whole church turned as one, and Charlotte's heart stopped in her chest. Edward Ashby was standing in the doorway. He was pale, and his hands were shaking, and he looked like a man walking to his own hanging. But he was standing, and he had spoken, and he came down the aisle now, on unsteady legs, with every eye in the valley on him. "Commissioner," Edward said, and his voice cracked and he pushed through it. "My name is Edward Ashby. I signed that affidavit 2 days ago. And I'm here to tell you before God and this whole room that every word of it is a lie. Victor Langford paid me $400 to swear it. He found me in Cheyenne, and he told me the marriage was a sham and asked me to attest to it. And I did for the money without ever asking whether it was true." His voice broke completely. "And it's not true. I don't know what's in these people's hearts. But I know Victor Langford handed me money to lie under oath, and I took it, and I'm ashamed, and I'm taking it back. The affidavit is false. I withdraw it. Do with me what the law does with a man who nearly perjured himself. I'd rather answer for that than for the other thing." The room erupted. Langford's lawyer was on his feet, shouting objections, and Langford's smile had finally cracked, and Commissioner Watts was hammering the gavel. And through all of it, Charlotte Bennet stared at the trembling coward she'd once been engaged to, and felt something she'd never expected to feel toward him again. Not love that was long dead, but a small, startled respect. He'd found it. One day too late, and for all the wrong reasons. But he'd found it. "Order!" Watts brought the gavel down hard. "Order in this room." The noise settled. "Mr. Ashby, you understand you've just confessed to signing a false oath. That's a serious matter, and you'll answer for it in its time." He fixed Langford's lawyer with a cold eye. "But it does mean the petition to void this marriage rests entirely on a sworn statement its own author has just renounced as purchased perjury. Counsel, do you have any other basis for the petition?" The lawyer's mouth opened and closed. "Commissioner, this is highly irregular. We'll need time to—" "You moved this hearing up on 12 hours' notice to deny the other side time," Watts said flatly. "I'll not now grant you a delay, because your one witness grew a conscience. The petition to void the marriage is denied. The Cole marriage stands as lawful, which means the household stands and the occupancy claim is closed in the Coles' favor as I ruled 2 weeks ago." He set down the gavel. "That concludes the business Mr. Langford filed." Langford's lawyer sat down. Langford himself had stopped smiling entirely, and Charlotte Bennet rose to her feet. "Commissioner Watts," she said, and her voice carried clear to every corner of the packed church. "You said that concludes the business Mr. Langford filed. But there's other business in this valley he didn't file. And since you've got the whole county gathered in one room for the first time in years, I'd ask the floor to speak to it." Langford's lawyer shot up. "Commissioner, this is out of order. The woman has no filing, no standing to—" "She has standing as a lawful landholder of this county," Watts said, "which this court just affirmed not 1 minute ago at your own client's insistence." A thin, grim smile crossed the commissioner's face. "You spent all night pulling strings to give yourselves a hearing, gentlemen. It would be a shame to waste the crowd." He turned to Charlotte. "The floor recognizes Mrs. Cole. Say your piece." "No." Charlotte walked to the front of the church, and she did not carry a single sheet of paper in her hands, because she had learned from her father that the truth told plain needed no props, and because the papers themselves, the whole mountain of them, were stacked on the table beside her, where every soul in the room could see them. "My name," she said, "is Charlotte Bennet Cole, and most of you have heard by now that I'm the mail-order kind the woman off the stagecoach married in an afternoon for a roof. Mr. Langford's been happy to have you believe it, so let me tell you who I really am." She looked out over the faces. "My father was Thomas Bennet of Philadelphia, an honest banker. 3 years ago he was asked to invest in a Western land scheme. He looked at the books, and he saw it was a fraud, a plan to strangle honest ranchers off their land by buying up their debt in secret and calling it all due at once. And my father refused. And more than refused, he threatened to expose it." Her voice was steady, and it was building. "So the men behind that scheme destroyed him. They printed lies in every Eastern paper, laid their own crimes at his door, ruined his name so thoroughly that when he swore he was innocent, no one believed him. He died a year ago, disgraced, penniless, certain the truth had died with him. She paused. It didn't, because he wrote it all down first. And in the last letter he ever wrote, he named the man he was certain stood behind the scheme. One name underlined 3 times. The room was dead silent. The name, Charlotte said, was Langford. Every head in the church turned toward the front pew. I came to this valley to find him, Charlotte went on. I didn't know I'd marry into the very fight my father died in. But I did, because the scheme he found in Philadelphia 3 years ago is the same scheme that's been eating this valley alive. Ask yourselves, how many of you carried a small note with the Cheyenne Bank? How many of you watched that bank go wobbly, get bought out, reorganized? How many of you had a stranger ride up your road 8 months later with your note in his hand, calling the whole thing due at once, forcing you to sign away your best land for pennies rather than lose it all? She saw the faces changing, saw the terrible recognition ripple through the pews. Amos Pruitt, stand up. Tell them it happened to you. Old Amos rose, hat in his hands. It happened to me, he said, his voice cracking across the silent church. 2 years back. Signed away the east half of my place. Thought I was the only fool it happened to. Widow Dean. It happened to me. The widow stood black-clad and iron-faced. The Langford man called my note. I signed. I thought I was alone. The Osgoods, the Reyes family. Stand up. All of you. They rose one after another, family after family, the whole scattered brotherhood of the ruined, coming to their feet in the light, and Charlotte watched Victor Langford's face as it happened, watched the patient smile die. Entirely, watched a man who had spent 15 years making sure his victims never stood in the same room. Understand that they were all standing now. 12 families, Charlotte said. 12 honest households robbed one at a time so quietly, so patiently, that none of you ever knew you weren't alone. That was the genius of it. He never took 2 in the same season. Never gave you cause to gather and compare. But you're gathered now. She turned to the table of documents. And it's all here. The note on the coal ranch bought in secret by the Langford Land and Cattle Company. The incorporation of the bank that was recapitalized 18 months ago by a company called Meridian Holding. And the incorporation of Meridian itself listing its sole principal officer. She lifted a single page. A man named Marcus Langford. Langford's lawyer half rose. My client's brother is not on trial. Victor Langford has no brother. Charlotte's voice cracked like a whip across the room. Everyone in this valley knows it. He's told half of you himself, the last of his line, no heir, nothing to leave. Marcus Langford does not exist. He is a ghost, a false name, a mask that Victor invented to hold his crimes at arm's length, so that when a man like my father came looking, the trail would run into a person who was never born. She turned toward the packed pews and lifted her voice. And there is a man in Cheyenne who watched Victor Langford sign that false name with his own hand and paid him $20 in gold to forget it 20 years ago. His name is Harold Fenwick. He's the territorial clerk. His own grandchildren were robbed by this scheme. She looked toward the church doors. And I'd hoped he'd be here to tell you himself. The doors opened. And Harold Fenwick, gray and trembling 100 miles from home and older than his years, walked into the church having ridden all night, and every head in the room turned, and Victor Langford went the color of ash. I'll tell them. Fenwick said, his old voice shaking but climbing. I watched him sign it. I watched Victor Langford sign the name Marcus Langford with his own hand in my office and hand me gold to keep quiet. I've carried it 20 years. I'll swear it to God and this court both. He looked at Langford, and there was 20 years of shame turning to fire in his face. You robbed my own grandchildren, Victor, my Osgood grandbabies, and I helped you file the paper that did it. Well, I'm done keeping your secret. I'm done being your poor memory. Do you hear me? I'm done. The church exploded. It was over faster than Charlotte had dared to hope, and slower than she would ever forget. Because a scheme that had survived 15 years on the silence of scattered, frightened victims could not survive 1 hour, with all of them in the same room. Commissioner Watts, honest at last, and fully took the documents into evidence one by one. The note, the Meridian filing Fenwick's sworn account. The 12 signed statements, Edward Ashby's confession of purchased perjury. He took them, and he read them into the record, and he did it slowly and publicly, so that no string Langford pulled afterward could make them disappear. Langford's lawyer fought it. He objected. He blustered. He demanded delays. And Watts denied him at every turn, because the man had spent all his cleverness moving the hearing up, and had left himself no ground to stand on when the hearing turned. And Victor Langford himself sat through it, the color gone out of him, watching 15 years of patient theft unravel in the space of a single morning, watching a woman with 38 cents and a dead man's letter take his kingdom apart in front of the whole valley he'd stolen it from. At the last, when it was plain the record was made and the evidence was sealed, and there would be a territorial investigation that no bought commissioner could stop. Victor Langford rose from his pew. The room went silent, braced for a threat. He didn't threaten. He looked at Charlotte for a long moment, and something almost like recognition passed over his ruined face. One predator acknowledging the one who'd finally brought him down. "Your father," Langford said quietly, "was a fool. He had one letter and no allies, and he died alone." His eyes moved across the packed church, the 12 risen families, the trembling clerk, the honest commissioner. "You had the same letter, and you built an army." He almost smiled, and it was a bitter, broken thing. "I made a mistake, Mrs. Cole. I destroyed your father for what he knew. I should have understood that a man's daughter might inherit more than his name." He gathered his coat. "I'll answer for it now, I expect. There's no undoing this room." And he walked out of the church a beaten man into the custody of a territorial marshal Watts had quietly sent for at dawn. The valley did not cheer. It was too stunned and too full of grief and too aware of everything that had been taken over the years that no verdict could give back. But slowly, one family at a time, the people who had been robbed in silence for 15 years began to turn to each other and to speak and to weep and to understand that it was over, that the thing that had eaten their valley in the dark had finally been dragged into the light and could not survive it. Charlotte found Nathan at the front of the church amid the noise, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. "Your father?" Nathan said finally. "He was right. All along he was right, and now the whole territory's going to know it. His name gets cleared, Charlotte. Not just here, everywhere. The territorial record shows the truth now. What they said about him in those Eastern papers, it gets undone." Charlotte's eyes filled. "He died thinking he'd failed," she whispered. "Thinking the truth died with his name. And it didn't. It just—" Her voice broke. "It just took a stagecoach 1,000 miles west and married a cowboy and waited a year to come out." "It took you 1,000 miles, Nathan said. "The truth didn't do anything. You did. He couldn't beat Langford alone. And you couldn't have done it alone either. You needed the Valley and Fenwick, and even that miserable Ashby finding his spine at the end." He took her hands, both of them, the way he had in the burned pasture. "That's the whole of what Langford never understood, Charlotte. Not about the papers, about people. He thought the way to win was to keep everyone alone. And the way you beat him was to make sure nobody was alone anymore. Not the families. Not your father's memory." His voice dropped. "Not you." Charlotte looked up at her husband in the church where they'd married 3 weeks before, in the last gold light of an evening, strangers with a bargain and a paper. And she understood standing there, that she was not standing beside a stranger anymore, and hadn't been for some time, and that whatever they had signed in that kitchen with a stub of pencil, it had quietly become something no contract had a word for. "There's still the contract," she said softly. "The one we signed. 2 years and then I go. It's got 1 year and 11 months left on it." Nathan Cole looked at her for a long moment. "There is," he said. "There's still the contract." And he didn't say anything more about it. Not there. not in the crowded church with the whole valley weeping and reeling around them, and a marshal leading Victor Langford out into the daylight, and Harold Fenwick sitting in a pew with his gray head in his hands, finally free of 20 years of a secret that had nearly killed him. But he held onto her hands, and he did not let them go. The letter came from Philadelphia 6 weeks later, and Charlotte's hands shook so hard she nearly couldn't open it. She'd known it was coming. The territorial investigation had moved fast once it had teeth, and word of Meridian, of the false name of a dozen ruined families, and a dead honest banker in the East, had traveled back along the same wires that had once carried her father's ruin. But knowing a thing is coming and holding it in your hands are two different weights entirely. And when Charlotte finally broke the seal and read the first line, she had to sit down on the porch step. "Nathan," she called, and her voice came out strange. "Nathan, come here." He came fast from the barn, half expecting trouble because trouble had been the shape of most things that had come up that road. But when he saw her face, he slowed and sat down beside her on the step, close the 8 feet of distance long since gone. "It's from a lawyer," Charlotte said. "In Philadelphia. One of the men who abandoned my father, one of the partners who walked away when the papers turned on him." Her voice trembled. "They've reopened his case. The territorial evidence forced it. And they've formally cleared his name. All of it. The fraud charges reversed. A public retraction printed in the same papers that ruined him. They're calling him what he was. An honest man who found a crime and paid for finding it." She pressed the letter to her chest. "My father is not a swindler anymore. He never was, but now the world knows it. Everywhere he was disgraced, he's redeemed. Everywhere." Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. He just put his arm around her and let her lean into him, and Charlotte wept the way she had not let herself weep at the graveside a year before. Not the tearing grief of loss, but something cleaner, the weeping of a wound finally allowed to close. "He can rest now," she whispered. "Wherever he is. He spent the last year of his life thinking he'd failed and left me nothing but a ruined name. And instead, he left me the one thing that mattered. He left me the truth, and he left me the stubbornness to carry it, and both of those things brought me here." She pulled back and looked at Nathan, tears streaming, but smiling through them. "He didn't leave me nothing, Nathan. He left me everything. He left me you in the end, though neither of us could have known it. Every choice that ruined him is a choice that put me on the road that led to this porch. He'd have liked it here," Nathan said quietly. "I think. An honest man on honest land." "He'd have loved it here," Charlotte said. "He'd have loved you. He always said the measure of a man was what he did when the truth cost him something." She wiped her face. "You handed back 4 times the value of this ranch rather than leave 12 families in the dark. He'd have shaken your hand and called you a fool, and meant it as the highest thing he knew how to say." The valley healed slowly through that autumn, but it healed. The territorial court, once it began pulling on the thread Charlotte had handed it, could not stop pulling. Victor Langford's whole crooked empire came apart, deed by deed. The land he'd stolen through Meridian was ordered, returned. Amos. Pruitt got back the east half of his place, and the widow Dean, her acres, and the Osgoods theirs, and family after family that had signed away their best ground for pennies, found it restored to them by a court that finally had the evidence to act. It didn't undo the years. Nothing could undo the years. But it gave the valley back its future, and that was a thing Charlotte had not been sure was possible when she'd first sat at Nathan's kitchen table, pulling apart a ruined man's books. Harold Fenwick came out to the ranch in the spring, no longer trembling to thank her in person, and to tell her that his Osgood grandchildren had their land again, and that he slept now for the first time in 20 years without the gold piece on his conscience. Even Edward Ashby got something like an ending, though not a happy one, and not one he'd earned. He answered for the false affidavit, as Watts had promised he would, and paid a fine, and left the territory quietly. Charlotte never saw him again, but she heard months later that he'd taken honest work back east, small work clerk's work, the kind he'd have sneered at once, and she found to her surprise that she hoped it lasted. He'd been a coward his whole life and had found one moment of courage at the very end in that church when it cost him everything and gained him nothing. It wasn't redemption. But it was more than she'd ever expected from him, and she chose to let that be enough. The ranch flourished. That was the plain fact of it. With the debt cleared and the fraud undone, and Charlotte's books running clean and tight, the Cole Ranch did. In 1 year, what it hadn't managed in 5, it turned a profit. The herd grew. The burned north pasture came back green. Ranch hands who'd been on the edge of quitting stayed and worked and became something closer to family than hired help. Neighbors who'd once whispered about the mail-order wife now came to Charlotte for advice on their own books, and she gave it, and the valley that had made Nathan's mother feel small for 30 years slowly without ever quite apologizing, made room for his wife instead. But through all of it, through the whole long healing year, there was one thing between Charlotte and Nathan that neither of them spoke of. The contract. It sat in the ledger box where Nathan had put it the day they signed it, folded around the terms of a bargain that had long since stopped describing anything true. $15 a month. Equal authority over the accounts. And the clause Charlotte had insisted on above all the rest, the one about the door I leave whenever I choose, and you don't argue. 2 years, they'd first said before, Charlotte had struck even that out, and made it hers to decide. And the 2 years neither of them had ever quite meant, whereas that autumn turned toward winter running out. It was Nathan who finally raised it on an evening a little more than a year after the stagecoach. He'd been quiet all through supper, quiet in the particular way Charlotte had learned meant he was working himself up to something hard, and she let him work up to it because she'd learned that too, that Nathan Cole came to difficult things slowly and could not be hurried and would say them plainly when he got there. When the dishes were done, he took the ledger box down from the shelf and set it on the table and opened it and drew out the folded contract and laid it between them the way he'd once laid his hat. "It's about a year and a month now," he said, "since we signed this." "I know," Charlotte said. "The bargain was 2 years, but you struck that out, made it yours to say when." He smoothed the paper flat with one scarred hand and did not look up from it. "So I've been thinking, it's not right me holding you to a thing you never fully agreed to. You never agreed to 2 years. You only agreed to stay till you chose to go." His jaw worked. "And I got no right to keep waiting for you to choose. It's not fair to you wondering. So I want to make it clean." He reached back into the box, and Charlotte saw with a small cold shock that there were more papers there than the contract, a whole sheaf of them prepared in his careful hand, and he laid them out one by one across the table. "There's a bank account," Nathan said. "In your name. I've been putting money into it since the spring out of what the ranch made. It's yours whether you stay or go, but it's enough to set you up anywhere. Philadelphia if you want to go home. Somewhere new if you don't." He laid down the next page. "There's a letter. A recommendation. Everything you did here, everything you are, anybody reads it, they'd hire you in a heartbeat, do bookkeeping for the finest house in any city." He laid down the last. "And there's a ticket. Open. Any coach, any direction whenever you want it. You don't even have to tell me you're going. You just go, and it's paid, and it's clean, and you owe me nothing." He finally looked up, and his face was steady, but his eyes were not. "That's your door, Charlotte. I said I'd never lock it. I'm doing better than that. I'm holding it open for you. Because you deserve a clear choice made free with no man's need pressing on it. Not mine. Not anybody's. You came here with 38 cents and no choices at all. I'd not have you leave the same way. I'd have you leave rich and free in choosing." Charlotte looked at the papers spread across the table. The account, the letter, the ticket. Everything she could have wanted a year ago when she'd stepped off that coach with nothing. Freedom and money and a clean road anywhere in the world. And she understood looking at it exactly what it had cost him to lay it there. "You're offering me everything," she said slowly. "And you're not asking me to stay." "No," Nathan said. His voice was rough. "I'm not asking you to stay." "Why not?" "Because if I ask, then you're staying for me." His hand closed on the table's edge. "You've spent a year here saving my ranch, and clearing your father's name and fighting a war you never signed up for, and every day of it, you've been the reason this place is standing. And I'll not have your last free choice be one you made because a man looked at you across a table and asked. You had a man do that once, Ashby wanting things from you, needing things from you, pressing his need onto you, till there was no room left for what you wanted. His voice dropped low and fierce. I'll be damned before I'm another one. So no, I'm not asking. I'm handing you the door and the money and the road, and I'm keeping my mouth shut about what I want, because what I want doesn't get a vote in your freedom. That's the whole of it. That's why not. And Charlotte Bennett, who had spent a year learning the exact shape of this man's decency, who had watched him keep his word the first night and every night since, who had watched him hand back a fortune rather than leave the valley in the dark, looked at Nathan Cole, holding open a door. He was breaking his own heart to hold. And she finally understood the whole of what she'd married by accident and by fate. Do you know what you just did? She said softly. He shook his head. You just told me exactly why I'm not going anywhere, Charlotte said. Nathan went very still. Every man I ever knew wanted something from me. She went on, and her voice was gaining strength the way it did when she'd found the true thing in a room. My father's partners wanted his money and threw him away when it got hard. Edward wanted a respectable match and threw me away when my name turned. Langford wanted this valley and would have thrown a dozen families in the grave to get it. My whole life, Nathan Love, has been another word for what a man could take. She reached across the table and put her hand flat on his. And then I married a stranger by accident, and for a year I waited for him to start wanting something from me too. I braced for it. I kept my father's secret half because I was afraid that the day you found out what I really came here for, you'd decide I owed you something. Her eyes filled. And instead, you spread everything I could ever want across this table and told me to take it and go and kept the one thing you wanted to yourself because you couldn't stand the thought of my freedom being 1 inch smaller than it ought to be. She was crying now openly. Do you understand what that is, Nathan? A man who'd rather lose me free than keep me obligated? That's the only kind of love I never got. That's the only kind worth staying for. Nathan Cole's face came apart the way it had that first night when she'd said the word husband in his mother's kitchen. Charlotte, let me finish. She turned his hand over and held it in both of hers. I read this contract 100 times when we first signed it, and there was one line I fought you hardest on. Do you remember I leave whenever I choose? My door. I made you write it because I'd spent a year in a locked room, and I swore I'd never be in another one. Her voice steadied and rang clear. Well, I'm choosing Nathan. Right now. With the door wide open and the money on the table and a clean road to anywhere on earth. I've got every reason to walk and nothing on this earth holding me here but what I want. She lifted his hand and pressed it against her cheek. And what I want is to stay, not for the ranch, not for the fight, not because I owe you a single thing you've made sure I don't. I want to stay because somewhere in the last year in the burned pasture and the crowded church and 100 ordinary suppers, I stopped being a woman running from her life and started being a woman who has one, here, with you. And I'm not leaving the first home I've had since my father died, Nathan Cole. Not for all the open tickets in the world. The kitchen was silent, but for the fire. And Nathan reached out slowly and took the contract off the table, the $15 a month, the 2 years the door. And he held it a moment, and then he tore it clean in half. Then we don't need this, he said, his voice thick. There's no bargain left in it. There hasn't been for a long while. I stopped thinking of you as a hired wife somewhere back around the fire, if I'm honest, maybe before. I just didn't have the right to say so, while that paper still had a hold on you. He tore it again and again until it was nothing but scraps in his hand. I love you, Charlotte. I've loved you a good long time, and kept it locked up tight because I was so afraid of being one more man who wanted something from you. But you're not staying out of any need of mine now. You're choosing free, so I can finally say it, and it's clean. He looked at her, and there were tears cutting down his weathered face, and he didn't wipe them away. I love you. Stay and let me spend the rest of my life proving it wasn't a bargain. It was never a bargain. It was the luckiest accident a drowning man ever had the day a woman with 38 cents stepped off a coach into my yard. Charlotte laughed through her tears, and it was the free whole laugh of a person who has finally set down a weight she'd carried 1,000 miles. I came here begging you for a job, she said. Do you remember 38 cents and a folded advertisement and nowhere left in the world to go? I came here begging a stranger for a job. She pressed her forehead to his, the way he'd done to her in the burned pasture soot and grief and fear all long since washed away. And somewhere along the way, Nathan, I stopped looking for work, and I stopped running from my old life, and I found the thing I'd stopped believing a person like me was allowed to have. I found my home. It was here the whole time. It was you the whole time. I just had to lose everything else first to see it. They married again in the spring, not because the first marriage hadn't held. It had held through fire and fraud and a courtroom, and a year of learning each other, held better than most marriages built on a great deal more than a stub of pencil and a deadline. They married again because the first time there had been a bargain and a deadline, and two strangers shaking hands in a plank church because the county said they had to, and this time there was none of that. This time there was only choice. The same little church held at the one where they'd beaten the sun down by a minute and a half. But it was full now, where the first time it had held only a preacher and two witnesses off the street. The whole valley came. Amos Pruitt stood up front in a collar that plainly strangled him, restored to his full land and his full dignity. The widow Dean wept openly in the second pew. The Osgoods came, and Harold Fenwick with them, a free man in every way that counted. The ranch hands who'd become family filled a whole row. Reverend Hollis, older and grayer, read the words he'd read a year before, and this time when he came to the end, he did not offer them a handshake. Last time, the old preacher said, his eyes bright, I told you nobody in this room would think the less of you if you only shook hands. I remember it clear. Well, he closed his book, the same book. There's not a soul in this valley now who doesn't know exactly what the two of you are to each other. So I'll say it the proper way this time, and you'll do it the proper way, and the whole county can watch. You may kiss your wife's son. You've earned the right, and God knows you took the long road to it. And Nathan Cole kissed his wife in a full church in the light of a spring morning, and the whole valley that had once whispered about the mail order kind rose to its feet and made a sound like a thing healing. Afterward in the churchyard, an old woman Charlotte didn't know took both her hands. It was one of the valley wives, one of the ones who'd whispered once, and her face was soft with something like apology. I knew his mother, the old woman said, Nathan's. She came out here the same way you did off a coach to a man she'd barely met. We were unkind to her. This whole valley was unkind to her for years over a thing that was none of our business. I've been ashamed of it a long time. She squeezed Charlotte's hands. I watched you this last year. Watched you fight for us. For all of us, even the ones who'd been unkind to his mother, and would have been unkind to you if you'd let us. You saved this whole valley, girl, and you did it while we were still deciding whether to trust you. Her old eyes filled. So, I wanted to be the one to say it on behalf of all of us who owe it. Welcome home. You're one of us now, and you have been for a while, and I'm sorry it took us so long to say so. Charlotte couldn't speak. She only held the old woman's hands and nodded and thought of Nathan's mother, who had died still hearing that word behind her back in church mail order, and who would never hear this welcome, this belonging, arriving one generation too late for her, and right on time for the woman who'd married her son. She'd be glad, Charlotte finally managed. His mother. She'd be glad it ended different for me than it did for her. She'd be glad it was you that ended it, the old woman said. The way you ended all of it. In the light where everybody could see. That night, when the valley had gone home and the ranch was quiet, Charlotte stood on the porch, where a year and a season before, she'd dropped a suitcase in the dirt and heard a stranger tell her he needed a wife before sunset. Nathan came and stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a long while, because they had reached the place in a marriage where silence is its own kind of talking. "You ever think about it?" he asked finally. "How close it came to not happening at all? You could have said no in that yard, could have gotten back on the coach. Widow Hargrove said no. The Peterson girl's father ran me off. Any one of a dozen women could have been standing here instead of you, and none of it would have your father, the valley, none of it." He shook his head slowly. "It all turned on you not getting back on that coach." "I think about it every day," Charlotte said. "But I've stopped calling it chance." She looked out at the dark mountains, the impossible spill of stars she'd first seen from a wagon seat, with a suitcase between them like a wall. "My father found a crime and paid for it with his life, and it looked like the end of everything. And every terrible thing that came after his ruin, Edward leaving my name in the mud. The 38 cents, every single one of them, was a door closing behind me. Hurting me west, hurting me to a valley I'd never have chosen, to a man I'd never have met, to the one fight in all the world where everything my father died knowing turned out to be the exact thing needed to win." She leaned her head against Nathan's shoulder. "That's not chance, Nathan. That's not luck. I don't know what to call it. But I know my father's death wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of mine. And they're the same story. They were always the same story. I just couldn't read it until I got to the end." Nathan put his arm around her. "You came here begging for a job," he said quietly, the old words, the true ones. "I came here begging for a job," Charlotte agreed. "And somewhere along the way, I found my home." She turned in the circle of his arm and looked up at her husband, and her voice was steady and clear. And it held no bargain in it, and no fear, and no running, not anymore, not ever again. "And I am never leaving it. Not for any open ticket, not for any city, not for anything the world can offer. This is where I belong, and this is where I stay, and that is the one thing in my whole life I am absolutely certain of." And she was.